The lukewarm black coffee in Elena Vance's chipped, world's okayest sister mug tasted like copper and burnt dirt when the encrypted ping from the Saharan sector flickered onto her monitor at 0314 on a Tuesday morning. She didn't flinch, didn't spill a drop, and didn't look away from the grainy, monochromatic feed of a desert crossroads that looked like the surface of the moon. To anyone else in the darkened ground control station at Creech Air Force Base, Elena was just another pilot in a flight suit, hunched over a console in a modified shipping container in the middle of the Nevada desert. They saw a woman who stayed late, spoke little, and followed the flight path with a mechanical, almost boring consistency. They didn't see the way her pupils dilated to track the 3-pixel shift in a heat bloom 3,000 miles away. They didn't see the way she was already calculating the wind shear over a mountain range she had never stepped foot on, feeling the invisible drag of the MQ-9 Reaper's wings as if they were her own shoulder blades. Elena Vance had grown up in Amac, Washington, a place where the winters were long enough to teach a girl the value of silence and the necessity of precision. Her father had been a master carpenter who measured 3 times and cut once, a man who taught her that a tool was only as good as the hand that held it and the mind that guided it. She had spent her teenage years splitting logs with a rhythmic, hypnotic accuracy that left her palms calloused and her mind tuned to the exact moment of impact. When she joined the Air Force, she didn't want to be in the cockpit of a fighter jet, screaming through the sky at Mach 2. She wanted the silence of the long-range scan. She wanted to be the ghost in the machine, the one who saw the world through a soda straw and understood it better than the people walking on its surface. The container, known colloquially as the box, smelled of ozone, stale popcorn from the shift before, and the distinct, metallic tang of high-end electronics running hot. Outside, the Nevada wind was scouring the sides of the metal structure with fine grit, but inside, the air was pressurized and dead. Elena's sensor operator, Senior Airman Kalen Key Miller, sat to her right. Key was 22, from a suburb of Chicago, and possessed a nervous energy that usually manifested in the constant tapping of a pen against his thigh. Today, however, Key was still. He had seen what Elena saw. He had watched her hands on the joystick, not moving it, but breathing on it, making adjustments so minute they were invisible to the naked eye. Elena had a gift that the instructors at Halaman hadn't been able to quantify. They called it unusually high spatial awareness, but that was a bureaucratic term for something much more visceral. She could feel the latency. Most pilots fought the 5-second delay between their movement in Nevada and the drone's response over the target. Elena lived inside that 5 seconds. She anticipated the lag, folding it into her movements until the drone wasn't a remote object, but a physical extension of her central nervous system. She was the only pilot in the 432nd Wing who could track a target through a sandstorm without losing the lock, a feat she accomplished by reading the micro-jitters in the thermal sensors that others dismissed as electronic noise. "Vane," Key whispered, using her call sign. "Look at the shadow on the southwest corner of the compound. It's too sharp for 3 in the morning." Elena zoomed the MTSB multispectral targeting system. The image bloomed in shades of gray. Key was right. The shadow wasn't a shadow, it was a thermal dampener, a high-tech fabric designed to mask the heat signature of whatever was beneath it. To a standard analyst at Langley, it would look like a patch of cool earth or a trick of the moonlight. To Elena, it looked like an invitation. She adjusted the Reaper's orbit, banking the bird at an angle that maximized the sensor's look-down capability while keeping the engine noise masked by the prevailing winds of the upper atmosphere. She wasn't just flying, she was hunting. She remembered the way her father would track deer in the Okanogan National Forest, watching not for the animal itself, but for the way the brush moved or the way the birds fell silent. She was looking for the silence in the desert. The target was a man the intelligence community had been chasing for 6 years. They called him the Architect. He didn't carry a radio, he didn't use a cell phone, and he never stayed in the same place for more than 4 hours. He was a ghost, and he was currently sitting under that thermal dampener, thinking he was invisible. Elena had found him not by looking for a person, but by looking for the absence of life. There was a 3-mile radius around that compound where the local goats wouldn't graze. The shepherds didn't know why, but Elena did. The security detail was using high-frequency perimeter emitters to keep the area clear. It was a footprint so faint that only someone who spent 16 hours a day staring at dirt would ever notice the pattern. "Contact the TOC," Elena said, her voice a low, steady hum that cut through the electronic buzz of the station. "Tell them we have a probable ID on Gold 1. We need a Priority 1 clearance for kinetic engagement." Key's fingers flew over the keyboard. "Ma'am, the Tactical Operations Center is saying we're in a hold pattern. There's a JSOC team out of Fort Bragg that's already in the air. They're 3 hours out. Command wants us to maintain eyes on and wait for the ground team." "The ground team won't make it," Elena said, her eyes never leaving the screen. She saw a flicker, a tiny orange pinprick of heat at the edge of the dampener. Someone had lit a cigarette. A mistake, a human moment in a calculated vacuum. "The weather front moving in from the north is going to ground their birds before they hit the LZ. If we don't take the shot now, we lose him for another 6 years." "Vane, you know the drill," Key said, his voice tight. "We're the eyes, Bragg is the fist. We don't swing unless they tell us to." Elena didn't respond. She was watching the cigarette. The way the heat moved suggested the person holding it was standing. They were getting ready to move. She checked her fuel state. She had 4 hours of station time left, but the window for a clean strike was closing in minutes. The compound sat on the edge of a narrow canyon. Once the target moved into the caves, he was gone. No drone, no JSOC team, no satellite could touch him then. She felt a familiar, cold pressure building in her chest, not the pressure of fear, but the pressure of knowing. It was the same feeling she had when she was 12 years old and watched a rotten branch hanging over her brother's swing set. Everyone told her it was fine, that it had been there for years, but she had seen the way the bark had begun to pull away from the trunk. She had waited until no one was looking and chopped the limb down herself. She had been grounded for a month, but her brother had stayed safe. The door to the GCS hissed open, and the desert heat surged in for a brief, punishing second before the climate control killed it. Colonel Marcus Thorne stepped into the dim light. Thorne was a man of impressive posture and even more impressive medals, a veteran of the real Air Force who had transitioned to drones when the writing on the wall became too large to ignore. He viewed the pilots at Creech as essential technicians, but he didn't view them as warriors. To Thorne, a pilot wasn't a pilot unless they were pulling G-force and sweating in a cockpit. He stood behind Elena, his presence a heavy, perfumed weight of starch and authority. "Status, Captain Vance?" Thorne asked. "Target is confirmed, sir," Elena said, her hands steady on the controls. "The architect is under the dampener at grid 44 Delta. He's preparing to move, requesting immediate authorization for a Hellfire strike. The window is less than 90 seconds. Thorne leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the screen. To him, it was just a blur of gray and black. "I don't see anything that confirms identity, Vance. All I see is a tarp in the desert. We have a Tier 1 team 500 miles out. We wait for the boots on the ground to confirm. They'll take him alive if they can. We need the intel." "He's moving toward the canyon, sir," Elena said, her voice rising slightly in pitch, the only sign of the adrenaline coursing through her. "If he reaches the cave system, the JSOC team will be walking into a meat grinder. The caves are mined. I can see the disturbance in the soil from the sensor's ground-penetrating sweep. It's a trap." Thorne chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Vance, you're reading tea leaves again. You're a sensor operator with a flight rating, not a psychic. Maintain your orbit. Hold your fire. That's a direct order. We wait for backup." Elena's jaw tightened. She could feel the heat of Thorne's breath on the back of her neck. He didn't see the world the way she did. He saw a career path, a series of boxes to be checked, a chain of command that must be honored above all else. He didn't see the 3-pixel shift. He didn't see the way the dust was swirling around the base of the dampener, indicating a vehicle was idling nearby, hidden from the overhead satellites, but visible to Elena's angled approach. He didn't see that in 60 seconds, a man who had planned the deaths of hundreds of Americans would vanish into the earth, leaving a trail of dead soldiers in his wake. "Sir, with all due respect, the backup won't make the LZ," Elena said, her voice dropping back into that terrifyingly calm register. "The storm is already peaking over the ridge. If you check the weather feed from the local nodes." "I've checked the weather, Captain," Thorne snapped, his patience evaporating. "The Blackhawks are rated for those winds. You worry about keeping that bird in the air and that camera on the target. Leave the tactical decisions to the people who aren't sitting in an air-conditioned box in Nevada. Am I clear?" "Crystal, sir," Elena said. Thorne turned to leave, satisfied that he had reasserted the natural order of things. He paused at the door. "And Vance, don't get ahead of yourself. You're a long-distance caller. Let the guys on the scene handle the heavy lifting." The door hissed shut. Silence returned to the container, save for the rhythmic tapping of Key's pen. "He's an idiot," Key whispered. "He's the commander," Elena replied. She watched the screen. The dampener moved. A man stepped out from beneath it. He was small, dressed in nondescript clothing, carrying a leather bag as if he were a doctor heading to a house call. He walked with a slight limp, an old injury from a Soviet landmine in the 80s. It was him, the architect. He looked up, his face a blurred oval of heat on the sensor. He couldn't see the Reaper. It was too high, too quiet, a predatory god hidden in the glare of the sun. But he knew it was there. He smiled, a jagged, dark line on the thermal feed, and began walking toward the waiting vehicle. Elena felt the controlled rage simmering beneath her skin. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger that led to mistakes. It was the cold, focused rage of a craftsman who sees a beautiful piece of wood being ruined by a dull blade. She looked at the mission clock. 52 seconds until he reached the cave entrance. She looked at the weather data. The JSOC team's helicopters were currently struggling with a 40-knot crosswind. They were going to be late. They were going to arrive just in time to get blown apart by the wides she could see buried in the sand like dragon's teeth. She had been in this position before. Not this specific mission, but this feeling. The feeling of being the only person in the room who saw the truth and the only person who was being told to ignore it. When she was in flight school, she had identified a mechanical failure in a trainer jet that the maintenance crew had missed 3 times. They told her she was being overly sensitive to the airframe. She had refused to fly the bird. They had given her a formal reprimand for insubordination. 2 days later, that same jet's engine had flamed out over the desert, nearly killing the instructor who had taken it up. They hadn't apologized. They had just moved her to the RPA program, thinking her sensitivity would be better suited to a desk. They were wrong. Her sensitivity was a weapon. "Key," she said. "Yeah, Vane. Switch the laser to combat override. I want a hard lock on the vehicle's engine block." Key stopped tapping his pen. He looked at her, his eyes wide in the glow of the monitors. "Vane," Thorne just said. "I know what he said," Elena interrupted. "I'm not asking for his permission. I'm telling you to paint the target. If we don't do this, those guys from Bragg are going to die. You saw the ground pen data. You saw the mines." Key looked at the screen, then back at Elena. He saw the woman from Amek, the woman who knew exactly how much force it took to split a log and exactly how much it cost to stay silent. He saw the lack of hesitation in her eyes. "Combat override engaged. Laser is hot. I've got a solid return." Elena's fingers danced across the console. She wasn't just preparing a strike. She was bypass coding the firing sequence to prevent the TOC from seeing the missile away notification until it was too late to abort. It was a trick she had learned by spending her off hours reading the source code of the Reaper's operating system, finding the backdoors that the engineers had left for emergency maintenance. She was rewiring the logic of the machine from 3,000 miles away. "Vane," Key said, his voice trembling. "They're going to court-martial us. They're going to strip your wings and put me in Leavenworth." "They might," Elena said, her thumb hovering over the weapon release. "But they won't be doing it at a funeral for 20 Rangers." She felt the weight of the moment. It was a heavy, physical thing, like the silence before a lightning strike. She thought about her dog, a golden retriever named Scout, who was currently sleeping on her porch back in her small rental house in Las Vegas. She thought about the way the light hit the mountains in Washington in the evening. She thought about the fact that she was about to end a man's life and potentially her own career, all because she saw something that a colonel chose to ignore. The architect reached the vehicle. He opened the door. In 30 seconds, he would be under the cover of the canyon walls, and the Reaper's Hellfire missiles wouldn't have the angle to hit him. "Target is moving," Key reported, his voice now a flat, professional monotone. He had made his choice. He was with her. "Speed is 10 knots, bearing 280. "I have the lead," Elena said. She adjusted the flight stick, bringing the Reaper into a shallow dive to increase the missile's kinetic energy. She was accounting for the 1.5-second delay, the wind, the humidity, and the slight vibration of the drone's airframe. She wasn't looking at the crosshairs. She was looking at where the vehicle would be when the missile arrived. She was looking into the future. In the TOC, 3 buildings away, a light would be flashing red on a console. A junior officer would be looking at it, confused, wondering why a Reaper in a holding pattern was suddenly changing altitude and activating its targeting laser. They would call Thorn. Thorn would scream. They would try to send a kill signal to her console. But Elena was faster. She had already locked the GCS door from the inside using the maintenance override. She had 5 minutes of total autonomy before they brought the bolt cutters. 15 seconds to cave entrance, Key said. Elena's heart rate was a steady 60 beats per minute. Her hands were marble. She felt a strange, detached sort of peace. This was what she was built for. Not the medals, not the rank, not the approval of men who saw the world through maps and spreadsheets. She was built for the moment of impact. "Weapon away," she whispered. The Reaper shuddered, a ghost of a movement that she felt in her own marrow. On the screen, a small, white shape detached from the wing and accelerated. It looked like a falling star, a streak of light cutting through the gray desert floor. Elena didn't watch the missile. She watched the target. She watched the architect's hand on the steering wheel. She watched the way he adjusted his mirrors, oblivious to the fact that his time had already run out. The explosion was silent on her end, a bloom of white heat that saturated the sensor, turning the screen into a blizzard of static for a fraction of a second. When the image cleared, the vehicle was gone. In its place was a blackened crater and a secondary explosion from the fuel tank that sent a plume of fire into the early morning sky. The shockwave triggered the wides she had seen buried in the sand, a chain reaction of fire that lit up the canyon mouth like a string of firecrackers. The meat grinder was being dismantled in a series of orange bursts. "Direct hit," Key said, his voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off. "Target destroyed. Secondary explosions confirmed. The canyon mouth is cleared." Elena didn't celebrate. She didn't pump her fist. She simply adjusted the Reaper's orbit, bringing it back to a level flight path. She checked her fuel. She checked her altitude. She was already beginning the post-strike assessment, looking for any signs of movement in the wreckage. There were none. The architect was no longer an architect of anything. Suddenly, the speakers in the GCS crackled to life. Thorn's voice, distorted by rage and the electronic interface, filled the room. "Vance, what the hell did you just do? I told you to hold. I told you to wait for backup. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've just compromised a multi-year operation. I'm coming down there right now, and you'd better have your rank ready to hand over because you're done. You hear me? You're finished." Elena reached over and turned the volume knob until Thorn's voice was a faint, angry buzz like a fly trapped in a jar. She looked at Key. He was pale, shaking, but he was looking at the screen with a sense of awe. "We got him, Vane," he whispered. "We actually got him." "We did," she said. She turned her attention back to the monitor. In the distance, through the heat haze and the smoke of the burning vehicle, she saw the lights of the JSOC helicopters appearing over the ridge. They were late. If she had waited, they would be landing right now, right in the middle of that minefield. She watched them hover, their sensors likely picking up the massive thermal signature of the destruction she had caused. They would be confused. They would be frustrated. They would be alive. Elena sat back in her chair. Her back ached. Her eyes burned from the hours of staring at the screen. She took a sip of her cold coffee and found that it no longer tasted like dirt. It tasted like nothing at all. She looked at her hands, the hands of a carpenter's daughter, and saw that they were perfectly still. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway outside. The handle of the door rattled, then shook violently as someone, Thorn, tried to force it open. Elena didn't move. She didn't look at the door. She looked at the screen, watching the smoke drift across the desert. "Key," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Log the strike. Time, coordinates, and result. Mark it as defensive suppression of enemy ambush. But Vane, the colonel said. The colonel wasn't flying the bird, Elena said, her voice like iron. I was, log it. The door to the container groaned under the pressure of a shoulder charge. A moment later, the electronic lock hissed as someone used a master key card from the outside. The door swung open, and Thorne stormed in, followed by 2 security forces airmen. His face was a deep, bruised purple, his chest heaving with exertion. Get away from that console, Vance, he roared. Step away right now. You're under arrest for disobeying a direct order in a combat zone. Elena didn't jump. She didn't even turn her head immediately. She finished her sip of coffee, set the mug down in the exact center of its coaster, and slowly stood up. She smoothed the front of her flight suit, adjusted her cap, and turned to face him. She stood at a perfect, rigid attention, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall just above Thorne's head. The target has been neutralized, sir, she said, her voice calm and clear. The JSOC team is currently moving to a cleared landing zone. All threats to the ground team have been eliminated. Thorne stepped into her personal space, his face inches from hers. She could smell the coffee and the desperation on him. I don't give a damn about the target. I gave you an order. You're a technician, Vance. You're a glorified gamer. You don't get to decide who lives and who dies. You wait for the men on the ground to do their jobs. The men on the ground would be dead, sir, Elena said, her voice not wavering by a single decibel. I saw the mines. I saw the ambush. I acted to protect the asset and the personnel. If that is a crime, I accept the consequences. Thorne looked like he was going to strike her. His hand hovered near his holster, a reflex from a man who wanted to exert control in a world that had just slipped through his fingers. You think you're a hero? You're a liability. You're a rogue element. Security, take her. Take them both. The airmen hesitated. They had seen the feed on the secondary monitors in the hallway. They knew who the target was. They knew what Elena had just done. But they also knew the weight of a colonel's stars. They moved forward, reaching for Elena's arms. She didn't resist. She didn't beg. She didn't even look at them. She looked at the monitor one last time, where the JSOC team was now fast-roping onto the sand, their movements crisp and safe in the shadow of the smoke she had created. They would find the architect's leather bag. They would find the intel that Thorne wanted. And they would never know that their lives had been saved by a woman in a box 3,000 miles away who had seen the world through a soda straw and refused to blink. As they led her out of the GCS, into the blinding, white-hot glare of the Nevada sun, Elena felt the desert wind against her face. It was harsh and dry and tasted of salt, but it felt real. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost in the machine. She felt like herself. This isn't over, Vance, Thorne hissed as they walked past him. You'll never see the inside of a cockpit again. You'll be lucky if you're scrubbing floors in a federal prison. Elena stopped. She turned her head just enough to look Thorne in the eye. For the first time that morning, a small, cold smile touched her lips, the smile of someone who knows something true that no one else will believe. I wasn't in a cockpit, Colonel, she said quietly. I was in the future, and you were late. The walk to the security vehicle was long, the gravel crunching under her boots with a sound that reminded her of the frozen ground in Amak. She saw the other pilots and sensor operators standing outside their own containers, watching her pass. Some looked away, afraid of the fallout. Others, the ones who had been in the program long enough to know the cost of the job, nodded almost imperceptibly. They knew. She was placed in the back of a Humvee, the metal seat hot through her flight suit. Key sat next to her, his head down, his hands shaking. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a brief, firm pressure, the kind of gesture her father used to make when a project was finished and the measurements were true. It's okay, Key, she said. They're going to destroy us, Vane, he whispered. No, Elena said, looking out the window at the endless, shimmering expanse of the Mojave. They're going to try, but they can't take back what we did. That man is gone. Those soldiers are alive. That's the only thing that's real. The vehicle began to move, kicking up a cloud of dust that swallowed the GCS behind them. Elena leaned her head back against the cold metal of the frame and closed her eyes. She could still see the gray and white world of the infrared sensor. She could still feel the phantom vibration of the Reaper's wings. She thought about the 1.5-second delay, the gap between the world as it is and the world as we perceive it. Most people lived their entire lives in that gap, never realizing they were behind. She had closed the gap. And as the Humvee drove her toward a future that was uncertain, dangerous, and likely painful, she realized she wouldn't change a single second of the time she had spent inside the machine. 3 hours later, the report reached the Pentagon. It was flagged as highly sensitive and under investigation. It detailed an unauthorized strike by a drone pilot at Creech AFB. It mentioned the destruction of a high-value target, the saving of a JSOC team, and the flagrant violation of a direct order. In an office deep within the E-ring, a woman with 3 stars on her shoulder read the report. She looked at the satellite imagery of the strike. She looked at the weather data. Then she looked at the name of the pilot. Elena Vance, the general whispered to herself. She picked up a red pen and circled the name. Then she looked at her aide, a young captain who was waiting for her reaction. "Sir, the colonel is recommending a full court-martial. He says she's a danger to the chain of command." The general looked back at the image of the burning vehicle in the desert. She saw the precision of the strike. She saw the way the pilot had accounted for variables that weren't even in the manual. She saw the ghost. "The colonel is an idiot," the general said, her voice as dry as the Nevada desert. "Tell him to hold the charges. I want to see the flight logs, all of them, from every mission she's ever flown." "Sir?" the aide asked, confused. She disobeyed a direct order. "I know," the general said, a strange light in her eyes. "I want to see what else she saw that nobody else was looking at." Back at Creech, Elena was sitting in a windowless room in the security forces headquarters. She was alone. There was no clock on the wall, no sound from the hallway. Just the hum of the air conditioning and the weight of her own silence. She wasn't thinking about the general, or the court-martial, or the career she had likely just ended. She was thinking about the shadow on the southwest corner of the compound. She was thinking about the way it had been just a few pixels too sharp. She was thinking about how beautiful the truth looked when you finally found it, even if you had to burn everything else down to see it. She waited. She didn't beg. She didn't perform her pain. She simply sat there, emotionally controlled, her hands resting flat on the table, waiting for the world to catch up to the one. 5 seconds she had already lived through. The door opened. It wasn't the security guards. It was a man she didn't recognize, dressed in a plain suit carrying a folder with no markings. He sat down across from her and looked at her for a long time. "Captain Vance," he said. "Yes. Do you know why I'm here?" "Because the architect had something in that bag that you didn't expect him to have," Elena said, her voice a cool, steady stream. The man froze. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "How could you possibly know that? The bag hasn't even been opened yet. The JSOC team is still on site." Elena leaned forward just an inch. "I didn't need to open the bag. I saw the way he carried it, the weight of it, the way he protected it with his body even when he thought he was alone. It wasn't paper. It wasn't a laptop. It was a pressurized container. It was heavy, stable, and cold." The man in the suit felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He looked at the woman sitting in front of him, this technician, this gamer, and for the first time he saw her. He saw the extraordinary capability that Thorne had dismissed as psychic tea leaf reading. He saw a woman who could read the world through a digital straw better than he could read it standing in the middle of a room. "What else did you see, Captain?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Elena looked at him, and for the first time in Part 1, the reader saw the true depth of the threat she had uncovered. It wasn't just the architect. It wasn't just an ambush. It was something much, much bigger. "I saw the coordinates on the map he was holding in the shadow of the dampener," she said. "He wasn't going to the caves to hide. He was going to meet a courier." "A courier for what?" Elena's eyes went dark, the gray and white world of the sensor reflected in her pupils even now. The third device, the one the CIA said didn't exist. The man in the suit went pale. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. He didn't say another word. He turned and ran out of the room, leaving the door hanging open. Elena didn't move. She listened to his footsteps fading down the hall. She knew what was coming. She knew the storm was just beginning. She had destroyed the target, but she had uncovered a war that no one was prepared to fight. She looked at her hands. They were still steady. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she was back in Amak, sitting on her father's workbench, watching him plane a piece of cedar. Asterisk, the wood tells you what it wants to be, asterisk, he had told her. Asterisk, you just have to listen to the grain. Asterisk, she was listening, and the grain of the world was screaming. Part 1 ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, terrifying realization that the backup she had been told to wait for wouldn't have just been late. They would have been too late to stop what was already in motion. The architect was dead, but the blueprint was already in the wind. And Elena Vance was the only person on Earth who had seen where it was going. The silence that followed the man's departure was not empty. It was a pressurized, industrial weight that pressed against Elena's eardrums until they pulsed with the rhythm of her own heart. She remained seated, her spine a perfectly vertical line against the hard plastic of the chair, her hands resting flat on the laminate tabletop. She did not tap her fingers. She did not check the door. She simply waited, her mind already back over the Atlantic, back over the shifting dunes of the Saharan sector, replaying the last 4 minutes of the flight log with the obsessive precision of a diamond cutter. In her mind's eye, the thermal feed was still live. She wasn't seeing the beige walls of the interrogation room at Creech. She was seeing the specific way the heat had pooled around the courier's vehicle 3 miles east of the impact site. She had caught it for exactly 4 frames, a glint of reflected radiation that shouldn't have been there, a signature that suggested a lead-lined casing hidden beneath a canvas shroud. The door didn't just open, it was thrown back against the wall with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed down the sterile hallway. 2 Air Force Security Forces airmen, their faces masked by the blank professionalism of the job, stepped inside. They were followed by a woman in a charcoal suit whose movements were so efficient they felt rehearsed. She wasn't the man from before. She was older, with graying hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead smooth. Behind her, lingering in the doorway like a bad omen, was Colonel Thorne. His face had transitioned from purple to a sallow, sickly gray, the look of a man who had realized too late that he was standing on a trapdoor. "Captain Vance," the woman in the suit said. Her voice was like a low-frequency hum, devoid of inflection. "I am Special Agent Sarah Miller with a FOSI. You are being moved. Stand up." Elena didn't ask where. She didn't ask why. She stood in one fluid motion, her boots clicking softly on the linoleum. As she passed Thorne, she didn't look at him, but she felt the radiation of his resentment. It was a physical heat, the kind that preceded a forest fire. He wanted to say something. She could hear the catch in his breath, the wet sound of teeth grinding, but the presence of the OSI agent acted as a gag. Elena was no longer his problem to solve or his subordinate to break. She had become something much more dangerous. She had become an asset. They walked through the labyrinthine corridors of the 432nd Wing Headquarters, a world of windowless halls and humming fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and ozone, the scent of a billion calculations happening simultaneously behind reinforced doors. They passed a break room where a television was muted, showing a weather map of the Midwest. Elena caught the flicker of a storm front moving over Nebraska, a swirling mass of white and green. Her mind instantly calculated the pressure gradient and how it would affect the fuel consumption of a C-17 transport if it were diverted. It was a reflex she couldn't turn off, a constant, low-level processing of the world's variables. They reached a heavy, steel-reinforced door marked with a TSIF placard. The airman on the left swiped a card and punched a 6-digit code into the keypad. The lock disengaged with a series of heavy thunks. Inside, the room was a miniature version of the Combined Air Operations Center, packed with high-definition displays and a dozen analysts who looked like they hadn't slept since the turn of the decade. At the center of the room stood a tall, lean woman with 3 stars on her shoulders. General Sarah Halloway. Halloway didn't look up when Elena entered. She was staring at a frozen frame of the architect's compound. "Is this the girl?" Halloway asked, her voice rasping like sandpaper on stone. "Captain Elena Vance, ma'am," Agent Miller replied. Halloway turned. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky over the Atlantic, cold, vast, and entirely indifferent to the comfort of others. She looked at Elena for a long, silent minute, the kind of silence that would have made a lesser officer start explaining themselves. Elena just stood there, her gaze fixed on the general's collar, her breathing slow and shallow. "The colonel says you're a loose cannon," Holloway said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the room. "He says you're a technician who thinks she's a tactician. He wants you in Leavenworth for the next 20 years. "I am aware of the colonel's position, ma'am," Elena said. "And yet," Holloway continued, walking toward her, "the JSOC commander just sent a burst transmission from the ground. They found the mines. Exactly where you said they would be. They also found the remnants of a shielding fabric that shouldn't exist in that part of the world. And they found a dead man with a limp who matches the profile of the architect. So, I have a choice. I can listen to a colonel who missed every single one of those details, or I can listen to the woman who saw them from 3,000 miles away through a lens the size of a dinner plate." Holloway stopped inches from Elena. "Tell me about the third device, and don't give me the intelligence summary. Give me what you saw." Elena didn't hesitate. "The architect was a distraction, ma'am. A high-value target designed to draw our focus and our kinetic resources to a single point. While we were orbiting the compound, a second vehicle, a nondescript Toyota Hilux with reinforced suspension, was moving through the wash 4 miles to the east. It was utilizing terrain masking and a low-frequency thermal dampener, but the driver was inexperienced. He was taking the turns too wide, causing the vehicle to tilt. In the tilt, for 0.3 of a second, the sensor caught the reflection of a lead-lined storage cylinder in the bed. Based on the way the vehicle settled on its springs after a bump, the weight of that cylinder is approximately 400 pounds. That's too heavy for documents or communications gear. It's the correct weight and shielding for a portable radiological dispersal device or a localized electromagnetic pulse generator. The coordinates the architect was looking at on his map were not for an escape route. They were for a handoff point at an abandoned wellhead 20 miles south. If the courier reaches that wellhead, the device enters the subterranean tunnels. Once it's in the tunnels, it can be moved to any of the coastal cities within 48 hours. We lose it forever." The room went silent. The analyst stopped typing. The hum of the servers seemed to drop an octave. Holloway looked at the screen, then back at Elena. "The wellhead," Holloway said. "Why aren't my satellites seeing it?" "Because the wellhead is covered by a rusted corrugated roof that has the same thermal signature as the surrounding rock," Elena said. "I found it by tracking the flight patterns of the local vulture population. They avoid that specific square acre. There's a high-frequency acoustic deterrent buried there. It's a signature, ma'am, just a quiet one." Holloway turned to the room. "Find that wellhead. Now." As the room erupted into a flurry of motion, Holloway moved closer to Elena, her voice dropping so low it was intended for her ears only. "You're not supposed to be this good, Vance. Nobody is. Where did you learn to read a landscape like that?" "My father was a carpenter in Washington, ma'am," Elena said, her voice steady but a shade softer. "He taught me that if you look at the grain long enough, it tells you where the knot is. The desert has a grain, you just have to be patient enough to see it." Holloway nodded, a sharp, single movement of her head. "The colonel is still going to try to ruin you. You broke the chain of command. You fired without authorization. In his world, that's the only sin that matters. But in my world, the only sin that matters is being wrong. You were right." "Where is Airman Miller?" Elena asked. "Your sensor operator." Holloway glanced at Agent Miller. "He's in a separate holding cell. He's terrified, Vance. He's 22 years old and he thinks his life is over because he followed you into the fire." "He did his job, ma'am. He shouldn't be punished for my decision." "That's not how the military works, and you know it," Holloway said. "But if you can find that courier, I might be able to make the insubordination look like a specialized mission profile. If you fail, I can't help you. I won't help you. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elena said. "Good, get back to the GCS. You're flying the backup bird. The Reaper you were using is being cycled for maintenance. We're putting you on a Block 5. It's faster, the sensors are sharper, and I've authorized a full combat load. If you see that Hilux, you don't call it in. You don't wait for a JSOC team that's currently 3 hours behind the curve. You take the shot. Am I clear?" "Crystal, ma'am." The walk back to the box felt different this time. The air was colder, the stakes no longer theoretical. Elena was no longer just a pilot. She was a hunter with a hunt that had been officially sanctioned by the highest power she had ever encountered. But she could feel the weight of it, the cost of the dark competence she possessed. To be this right meant being alone. It meant seeing the world in a way that made other people uncomfortable. It meant that even her victory would be viewed with a side eye of suspicion. When she stepped into the GCS, the smell of ozone and stale coffee hit her like a physical blow, a familiar and grounding sensation. Key was already there, sitting at the sensor console. He looked smaller than he had 4 hours ago, his shoulders hunched, his hands trembling as he reached for his water bottle. When he saw Elena, his eyes widened, a mixture of relief and pure, unadulterated terror. "Vane," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They told me we were going to jail. They told me I'd never see Chicago again." Elena sat in her chair, the familiar leather creaking under her weight. She didn't look at him. She began the pre-flight checks, her fingers moving across the switches with a rhythmic, hypnotic speed. "Focus, Key, we have work to do." "Work, Vane, Thorne is outside. He looked like he wanted to kill you." "Thorne is a ghost," Elena said, her voice flat. "The general gave us a mission. We're looking for a hillocks, 20 miles south of the first strike. Abandoned wellhead. Find the acoustic deterrent signature." Key hesitated, his hand hovering over the joystick. Are we legal? "We're the only thing that matters right now," Elena said. She turned her head and looked at him. She saw the boy from the Chicago suburbs, the one who joined the Air Force because he liked the idea of being part of something bigger than himself. She saw the fear in him, the way it lived in the corners of his mouth. "Key, look at me." He looked. "I won't let them take you," she said. It was the first time she had made a promise that wasn't mission-oriented. It felt heavy, like a stone in her pocket. "But you have to be the best sensor operator in the world for the next 3 hours. Can you do that?" Key swallowed hard. He wiped his palms on his flight suit. He nodded once, then again. Yeah, I can do that." "Good, laser to standby. Bring up the MTSB, we're hunting." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in tension. The desert floor shifted under the Reaper's eye, a sea of browns and ochres that looked identical to the untrained eye. But Elena wasn't looking at the big picture. She was looking for the anomalies. She was looking for the way the dust settled in the wake of a moving object. She was looking for the micro-jitters in the air that suggested a vehicle's engine heat was being suppressed, but not eliminated. The silence in the GCS was absolute, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans and the occasional, clipped exchange of coordinates. Elena lived in the 1.5-second delay, her mind projected across the globe, her body a mere conduit for the machine. She felt the Reaper's wings biting into the thin, cold air of the upper atmosphere. She felt the slight vibration of the engine. She was the ghost again, the invisible observer. "Vane," Key said, his voice taut as a wire. "I've got something. Grid 45 Sierra, it's faint, very faint." Elena swung the camera. She saw it, not a vehicle, but a disturbance. A plume of dust so thin it was almost translucent, rising from behind a jagged ridge of rock. It was moving fast, faster than any civilian would drive in this terrain. "Zoom in," she commanded. The image bloomed. There it was. The Toyota Hilux. It was painted a dull, matte tan that blended perfectly with the sand, but Elena could see the way it rode low in the back. The third device. It was there, 400 pounds of catastrophe hidden under a tarp. "Target confirmed," Elena said. Her voice was a low hum, the sound of a predator closing in. "Laser lock, combat override." "Vane," Key said, his voice trembling again. "There's a problem." "Speak." "Look at the horizon, 5 miles ahead of the hillocks." Elena adjusted the sensor's angle, looking past the target. She saw them. A cluster of tents, small and white, huddled in the shadow of a cliff. A refugee camp or a nomadic settlement. There were people there. Dozens of them. She could see the heat signatures of children playing in the dirt, of fires being lit for the evening meal. The wellhead was on the other side of that camp. To reach it, the courier had to drive right through the center of the settlement. "If we take the shot now," Key said, his voice barely a whisper, "the blast radius." "It's too close, Vane. The hellfire will take out half that camp. The secondary explosion from the device. If it's what you think it is, it could be worse." Elena felt the cold pressure in her chest intensify. This was the trap. The courier knew they were being watched. They weren't just moving the device, they were using a human shield of the most vulnerable people on Earth. Time to target? Elena asked. 6 minutes until he hits the perimeter of the camp, Key said. After that, he's in the middle of the tents for another 3 minutes. Then he's at the wellhead. Once he hits the wellhead, he's underground in seconds. Elena's mind raced. If she fired now, she killed innocent people. If she waited until he was in the camp, she killed more. If she waited until he was at the wellhead, she risked the device being moved into the tunnel system, where a strike would be useless, and the radiological fallout could be trapped and concentrated, or worse, the strike could fail to penetrate the reinforced structure. It was a calculation with no right answer. It was the kind of decision that people in Washington made over mahogany tables, months after the fact. Elena had to make it in seconds in a shipping container in the middle of a desert, while a colonel who hated her watched her every move from the hallway. "We can't hit him in the camp," Elena said. "Then we lose him," Key said. "Vane, if he gets that device underground, it's over," the general said. "I know what the general said," Elena interrupted. She was staring at the screen, her eyes tracking the hillocks's path. She saw something, a narrow gap between two rock formations, half a mile before the camp. The path narrowed there, the ground dropping away into a steep ravine on one side. It was a choke point, a place where a driver's focus would have to be absolute. "Key, can you put the laser on the front left tire? Not the engine, the tire." Key blinked. The tire, Vane, were 3 miles up. The CEP on a Hellfire is good, but hitting a moving tire, that's not in the manual. "The manual was written for people who can't see the grain," Elena said. "I need you to lead the target by exactly 2.4 meters. Account for the crosswind from the ravine. I'm going to drop the Reaper's nose and increase the airspeed. We're going to use the missile's kinetic energy to shear the axle instead of just blowing the whole thing up." "You want to flip it," Key said, realization dawning on him. "You want to flip the truck into the ravine before it hits the camp. If we flip it, the device stays above ground but the vehicle is immobilized. We buy the JSOC team time to get there, and we do it without killing the people in those tents. And if you miss?" Elena looked at the screen. She saw the children playing in the dirt. She saw the grain of the world, and she saw the knot. "I won't miss." She pushed the flight stick forward. The Reaper screamed as it dove, the air screaming over the pylons. In the GCS, the alarms began to wail, a V&E velocity never exceed warning. The drone was being pushed past its structural limits. The airframe was vibrating, a violent, bone-shaking shudder that Elena felt in her own teeth. "Vane, the wings, we're going to lose the wings," Key shouted. "Hold it steady, Key, paint the tire." The world narrowed to a single point, the one. 5-second delay felt like an eternity. Elena was no longer breathing. She was a statue, a part of the machine, her soul poured into the glass and steel of the sensor. She saw the tire. She saw the way the rubber deformed as it hit a rock. She saw the exact moment to strike. "Weapon away," she whispered. The missile didn't just fall, it was launched like a javelin. It blurred across the screen, a streak of white fire. For 2 seconds, the world was silent. The impact was a work of brutal art. The Hellfire didn't detonate on the cab. It struck the front axle with the force of a falling building. The front of the hillocks vanished in a cloud of dust and sparks. The back of the truck, carrying the 400-pound cylinder, whipped upward. The vehicle pirouetted in the air, a 2-ton beast of metal and fire, before slamming down on its side and sliding toward the edge of the ravine. It stopped 6 inches from the drop. "Direct hit," Key gasped, his hands flying to his face. "The axle is gone. It's not moving. Vane, it's not moving." Elena didn't exhale. She watched the dust settle. The tarp had been torn away, revealing the lead-lined cylinder. It was dented, but intact. The driver's door opened, and a man crawled out, his face covered in blood. He looked toward the refugee camp, then toward the ravine. He reached back into the truck, his hand searching for something. "He's going for the detonator," Elena said. Her voice was cold, a serrated edge. "Key, zoom in on his hand." The man pulled a small black box from the dash. He was shaking, his fingers fumbling with a switch. He looked up at the sky as if he could see the Reaper circling above him. He knew he was dead. He knew his mission had failed. He wanted to take the world with him. Vane, he's going to trigger it. Take the shot. Blow the whole thing. Key was screaming now. Elena's thumb hovered over the second weapon release. She had one hellfire left. If she fired, she would trigger the device. The refugee camp was too close. The fallout would be catastrophic. No, Elena said. No, Vane, he's going to push the button. He's not, Elena said. She adjusted the camera, looking past the man toward the ridge. A flash of light caught her eye. Not the sun, a lens. JSOC, she whispered. From the rocks above the ravine, a single, high-velocity round streaked through the air. It was invisible to the sensor until the moment of impact. The man's head snapped back, a mist of red blooming in the air. He slumped against the side of the truck, the black box falling from his dead fingers and tumbling into the ravine. Silence returned to the desert. Elena sat back. The alarms in the GCS were still screaming, warning of structural damage to the drone, but she didn't hear them. She watched as 4 men in sand-colored fatigues emerged from the rocks, moving with the fluid, predatory grace of Tier 1 operators. They surrounded the truck, their weapons held at the ready. One of them looked up and flashed a thumbs up at the sky. They were already there, Key said, his voice trembling with relief. They were waiting for us to stop him. They were waiting for someone to stop him, Elena corrected. She began the process of leveling the Reaper, her hands finally starting to feel the phantom vibration of the dive. She checked the fuel. She checked the airframe integrity. The Block 5 was battered, its wings likely stressed to the point of retirement, but it was still flying. Suddenly, the door to the GCS hissed open. It wasn't Thorne. It wasn't the guards. It was General Holloway. She stood in the doorway, her hands behind her back, her expression unreadable. She looked at the screen, at the dead man, the immobilized truck, and the JSOC team securing the cylinder. "Nice shot, Captain," Holloway said. "Thank you, ma'am." "The JSOC commander wants your name," Holloway continued. "He said he's never seen a drone pilot pull a kinetic shear like that. He said you saved his team and about 300 civilians." Elena didn't respond. She didn't know how to receive praise for something that had felt as natural and as necessary as breathing. However, Holloway said, her voice turning sharp, "Colonel Thorne has already filed the paperwork for your court-martial. He's citing the damage to the airframe, the unauthorized dive, and the risk you took with the local population. He's making a strong case, Vance. On paper, you're a disaster." "I understand, ma'am," Elena said. "Do you?" Holloway walked to the console and looked Elena in the eye. "You've made a lot of enemies today, Captain. People don't like being proven wrong. They especially don't like being proven wrong by someone who doesn't play by their rules. You've just become a very expensive problem for the United States Air Force." "What happens now?" Key asked, his voice small. Holloway looked at the young airman, then back at Elena. Now the politics start. The cylinder is being moved to a secure facility, the architect's network is being dismantled, and you two are being grounded, indefinitely, pending the investigation. Thorne stepped into the room then, a smug, dark satisfaction on his face. He held a digital tablet in his hand. "Captain Vance, Airman Miller, you are to report to the legal office at 0800 tomorrow morning. Your flight ratings are suspended. Your security clearances are under review. Hand over your badges." Elena didn't flinch. She reached up, unclipped her badge from her flight suit, and placed it on the console. Key did the same, his hand shaking so hard the badge clattered against the plastic. As they walked out of the GCS for the second time that day, the Nevada sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. It was a beautiful, peaceful sight, a stark contrast to the violence and the grayscale world they had just left behind. "Vane," Key said as they walked toward the barracks. "What are we going to do?" Elena stopped and looked at the horizon. She thought about Amak, she thought about her father's workshop, she thought about the grain of the wood and the truth of the cut. "We're going to wait," she said. "Wait for what?" "For the rest of the world to see what I saw," she said. But as she spoke, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb beside them. The door opened, and the man in the suit from the interrogation room stepped out. He wasn't running this time, he looked calm, he looked dangerous. "Captain Vance," he said, "get in." "I'm under investigation," Elena said. "I'm not supposed to leave the base." "The investigation has changed," the man said. He held up a folder. It was different from the one before. This one had a seal Elena had never seen, a stylized eagle wrapped in a circuit board. "We just opened the cylinder, Captain. It wasn't a radiological device. It wasn't an EMP." Elena felt a cold chill wash over her. Then what was it? The man looked at Key, then back at Elena. It was a server, and it wasn't empty. It contains the names of every deep cover asset the United States has in the Middle East, and someone was already accessing it when you took the shot. Elena's mind flashed back to the hillocks. She saw the man crawling out of the wreck. She saw the black box he had reached for, the one she thought was a detonator. "The box," she whispered. "It wasn't a trigger. It was a wireless uplink." "Exactly," the man said. "The data was being transmitted when the JSOC sniper took him out. We need to know where it was going, and we need to know it 5 minutes ago. You're the only person who has the sensor logs from the entire flight. You're the only one who saw the signal's origin." Elena looked at the SUV. She looked at Key, who was staring at her with wide, uncomprehending eyes. She looked back at the GCS, where Thorne was likely already deleting her files and celebrating her downfall. She realized then that the cost of being right was about to get much higher. The institutional failure wasn't just about a colonel's ego or a broken chain of command. It was about a system that was so focused on the target that it had missed the war happening in the air around it. "Key," she said. "Yeah, go to the barracks, stay there, don't talk to anyone, not even JAG. Vane, what are you doing?" Elena looked at the man in the suit. She didn't beg, she didn't ask for protection. She simply stepped toward the vehicle. "I'm going to find the signal," she said. She got into the SUV. The door closed with a heavy, muffled thud, sealing her into a world of leather and silence. As the vehicle sped away from the base, Elena looked out the back window. She saw the lights of Creech receding into the darkness, a small island of order in a vast, chaotic desert. She knew she might never go back. She knew that by tomorrow she would be a ghost, not just in the machine, but in the world. But she also knew that she was the only one who could see the grain, and the grain was leading her into a darkness that no one else even knew existed. The man in the suit handed her a tablet. "This is the raw data from the JSOC team's capture. Look at the timestamp on the uplink." Elena looked. She saw the numbers. She saw the frequency. And then she saw the destination. The signal wasn't going to a cave in the desert. It wasn't going to a foreign capital. It was going to a terminal inside the Pentagon. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. The betrayal wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from within the very heart of the machine she had dedicated her life to serving. "The architect didn't work for them," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "He worked for us." The man in the suit didn't say anything. He just looked out the window as the car sped toward a private airfield where a jet was waiting to take her to a place that didn't exist on any map. Elena leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She thought about the 5-second delay. She had thought she had closed the gap. But as the car accelerated into the night, she realized that the gap was wider than she could ever have imagined, and she was falling right into the center of it. The story was no longer about a drone strike or a high-value target. It was about a woman who had seen too much, and the people who would do anything to make sure she never saw anything again. The desert wind howled outside the car, a lonely, mourning sound. Elena Vance, the carpenter's daughter from Amak, sat in the darkness, her hands steady, her mind sharp, waiting for the moment when the grain would finally break. And then her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text message from an unknown number. Asterisk, they're coming for the airmen. Run. Asterisk, Elena's heart skipped a single beat. She looked at the man in the suit. He was watching her. He had seen the glow of the phone. He smiled, a small, sharp, jagged line that looked exactly like the architect's smile on the thermal feed. "Is there a problem, Captain?" he asked. Elena tucked the phone away. Her face was a mask of stone. "No," she said. "No problem at all." She reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The child locks were engaged. The SUV wasn't taking her to an airfield. It was taking her to the desert. The realization was a cold, hard fact. She had been right about everything, and that was exactly why she had to disappear. She looked out the window at the passing darkness. She saw the shadow of a mountain. She saw the glint of the moon on a distant fence. And then she saw the grain. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She simply leaned forward and whispered into the man's ear. "You should have checked the weight of my mug," she said. The man frowned. "What?" Elena didn't explain. She didn't have to. 3 seconds later, the GPS tracker she had hidden in the hollowed-out base of her World's Okayest Sister mug, the one she had forgotten on the console in the GCS, triggered a remote override signal she had pre-programmed into the base's security grid. The SUV's engine died. The brakes locked. The vehicle skidded across the road, spinning wildly in the sand. Elena didn't wait for it to stop. She braced her feet against the dash, her muscles coiling like a spring. The world was about to break, and she was going to be the one who chose the direction of the shatter. The car slammed into a ditch, the airbags deploying with a deafening bang. In the chaos of smoke and white powder, Elena found the manual release she had scouted for the moment she sat down. She rolled out of the car, the desert air hitting her like a cold shower. She didn't look back. She ran into the darkness, her boots hitting the sand with the rhythmic, hypnotic accuracy of a girl splitting logs in the Washington winter. She was alone. She was hunted. She was a ghost. And for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she needed to be. Behind her, the headlights of the SUV flickered and died, leaving the desert in total, absolute silence. Elena Vance kept running, her eyes fixed on the stars, searching for the one signal that would tell her where to go next. The grain was screaming, and she was finally ready to scream back. The sand in Elena Vance's mouth tasted like copper and old pennies, a sharp, metallic reminder that the world had just tried to swallow her whole. She lay in the scrub brush 30 yards from the smoking ruin of the SUV, her chest heaving in shallow, disciplined sips of air. The desert night was a wall of absolute cold, the kind that didn't just sit on the skin but sank into the marrow, yet the sweat slicking her palms was hot. Above her, the Nevada sky was an indifferent sprawl of white-hot stars, millions of eyes watching a woman who had, 5 minutes ago, officially ceased to exist in the eyes of the United States Air Force. She didn't move. She didn't check her pulse. She waited for the ringing in her ears to subside until she could hear the specific, rhythmic ticking of the SUV's cooling engine. It was a countdown. In her mind, she was already calculating the response time from Creech. If the man in the suit was who she thought he was, the official response would be a recovery team that wouldn't be looking for survivors. They would be looking for the file, and they would be looking to clean the site. She rolled onto her stomach, the movement sending a jagged spike of white light through her vision. Concussion. Grade 2, likely. She ignored it the way she ignored the persistent throb in her left shoulder where the seatbelt had nearly snapped her collarbone. She focused on the grain. The desert wasn't just empty space, it was a series of tactical layers. There was the slope of the ditch, the silhouette of the Joshua trees, and the high-tension power lines humming a mile to the west. That hum was a frequency, and frequencies were maps. She reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out the small, ruggedized tablet she'd swiped from the man in the suit during the tumble. The screen was cracked, but the backlight flickered to life, casting a ghostly blue glow over her face. She didn't have much time. The uplink she'd seen, the one heading to the Pentagon, wasn't a ghost. It was a live tap. And if it was still active, she was the only person on the planet who could trace the terminal on the other end. She stood up, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She didn't head for the road. The road was a trap, a linear path for a drone's infrared sensor. Instead, she turned toward the mountains, toward the jagged, black teeth of the Desert National Wildlife Refuge. She knew there was an old atmospheric testing array out there, a relic of the Cold War that had been decommissioned in the 90s. It was a dark site, invisible to modern mapping, but still connected to the base's legacy fiber-optic backbone. If she could reach it, she could plug in. She could bypass the firewalls that Thorne and his handlers had slammed shut behind her. Every step cost her. The sand was deep and loose, pulling at her boots, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the crash was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. She thought about Key. She thought about him sitting in that barracks room, waiting for a knock on the door that would end his life as he knew it. He was a kid from the suburbs who liked video games and believed in the good guys. He wasn't built for the dark, but she was. She had been built for it by a father who told her that the most dangerous thing in the world was a man who thought he was doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. She had been built for it by an institution that had taught her how to kill from 3 miles up without ever smelling the blood. A low, distant thrumming began to vibrate in the soles of her feet. Helicopter. A MH-6 little bird, likely out of Nellie's, flying low and blacked out. They were using terrain following radar. They would be on the crash site in less than 3 minutes. Elena dropped to her knees, pulling a thermal poncho from her survival kit and draping it over herself. She became a rock, a shadow. She watched as the black shape of the bird swept over the ditch, its searchlight cutting a brutal, white path through the dust. She didn't breathe. She watched the light pass over the SUV, lingering on the open door, the empty seats, the blood on the airbag. She saw the figures fast rope down, 4 men in gray tactical gear, moving with the synchronized, lethal grace of a specialized recovery unit. They weren't wearing Air Force blue. They were great contractors, the kind of men who worked for the agencies that didn't have names. She waited until they were focused on the wreck, their flashlights dancing inside the cabin. Then she moved. She didn't run, she glided, keeping her profile low, using the rhythmic hum of the power lines to mask the sound of her boots. She was 3 miles from the relay station. In her current condition, that was a lifetime, but she had the grain. She saw the way the wind moved the sand, creating natural depressions she could use for cover. She saw the way the starlight hit the quartz in the rocks, giving her a navigational heading that didn't require a GPS. An hour later, the relay station rose out of the darkness like a skeletal finger pointing at the moon. It was a rusted, chain-link-enclosed nightmare of microwave dishes and peeling paint. Elena reached the fence and didn't look for a gate. She found the corner where the tension was highest and used her multi-tool to shear the wire. The snap was loud, a sharp **ping* that felt like a gunshot in the silence, but she was already through. Inside the main shack, the air smelled of dead mice and ancient, ionized dust. She found the primary terminal, a heavy, rack-mounted unit that looked like it belonged in a museum. She didn't need the screen, she needed the port. She pulled the cracked tablet from her pocket, stripped the casing off a data cable with her teeth, and began to hotwire a connection directly into the station's backbone. Her fingers were shaking, not from fear, but from the onset of shock. She bit her lip until the pain sharpened her focus. "Come on," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Talk to me." The tablet blinked. Lines of code began to scroll, a chaotic, green waterfall of data. Elena's eyes moved with the speed of a machine. She wasn't reading the words, she was looking for the anomalies in the packet headers. She was looking for the signature of the architect's server. And then, she saw it. The signal wasn't just going to the Pentagon. It was being routed through a sub-level server in the E-ring, then bounced to a private cloud hosted by a defense contractor in Northern Virginia. *Apex Solutions. She knew the name. They were the ones who provided the AI targeting algorithms for the Reaper fleet. The betrayal wasn't just a few corrupt officers. It was the system itself. The AI wasn't just identifying targets. It was being fed names of people who were inconvenient to the contractor's interests, journalists, local leaders, and even our own assets who knew too much. The architect hadn't been a terrorist. He had been a whistleblower who had stolen the server to prove what Apex was doing. And she, Elena Vance, had been the one to pull the trigger and silence him. The weight of it hit her then, a physical blow that forced her to lean against the cold metal of the terminal. She hadn't been a hero. She hadn't been right. She had been the ultimate tool of a corporate execution. The kinetic shear she was so proud of hadn't saved lives, it had merely ensured the evidence didn't burn. "Oh, God," she breathed. A red light began to pulse on the tablet. *trace detected. They had her. The moment she'd plugged into the backbone, she'd lit a flare in the dark. She heard the sound of the helicopter returning, the rotor wash hitting the rusted dishes outside and making them scream like dying birds. She didn't have time to download the whole file. She looked at the progress bar, 12%. She needed 5 minutes. She didn't have 30 seconds. She grabbed her M9 sidearm from her holster, checked the chamber, and moved to the door. She wasn't the girl from Amek anymore. She wasn't the pilot in the box. She was a woman standing on the edge of a grave she had helped dig, and she was done being the tool. The first gray suit came through the fence 10 seconds later. He was moving fast, his NVGs glowing a ghostly green on his helmet. He didn't see her. He was looking at the shack, his weapon raised. Elena didn't wait for him to clear the corner. She stepped out into the wind, her stance wide and low, and fired twice. The rounds hit him in the center of his chest plate, the force knocking him backward. He wasn't dead, but he was down. Contact. West side? A voice shouted over the wind. Flashes of muzzle fire erupted from the darkness. Bullets chewed through the rotted wood of the shack, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Elena dived back inside, the air suddenly thick with the smell of ozone and burnt cedar. She crawled toward the terminal, her eyes on the tablet. 24%. "Keep coming," she hissed, her teeth bared in a snarl of controlled rage. She reached into her bag and pulled out a flare, not a signal flare, but a high-intensity magnesium torch used for emergency welding. She cracked it, and the room exploded in a blinding, white-blue light. To the men outside wearing night vision, the shack would suddenly become the surface of the sun. She heard the screams of pain as their sensors overloaded, blinding them. She used those seconds to move. She didn't go out the door. She kicked out a loose board in the back of the shack and rolled into the dirt, circling around the perimeter. She saw the second man clutching his face, his rifle swinging wildly. She didn't shoot him. She stepped in close, used the butt of her pistol to strike the base of his skull, and took his radio and a flashbang from his vest. "Status, Alpha, report." The radio crackled. It was Thorne. She would know that voice anywhere, the sound of a man who thought he was a king because he knew how to sign a death warrant. Elena keyed the mic. "He's busy, Colonel." There was a long, heavy silence. The wind howled through the dishes, a mournful, industrial sound. "Captain Vance," Thorne's voice came back, cold and measured. "You're making this very difficult for everyone. You've already destroyed your career. Don't destroy your life. Give us the tablet, and I can still get you a quiet discharge. We can say the crash confused you. Post-traumatic stress." "I saw the signal, Thorne," Elena said, her voice steady, echoing the calm she had learned in the 1.5-second delay. "I saw Apex. I saw what you're doing with the algorithms. You're not fighting a war, you're running a cleaning service. We're protecting the interests of the United States," Thorne snapped. "The world is a messy place, Elena. Someone has to decide which messes get cleaned up. You were good at it. You were the best we had. Why start caring now?" "Because I looked at the grain," she said. "And the grain says you're the not." She dropped the radio and pulled the pin on the flashbang, tossing it toward the gap in the fence where the last two men were regrouping. The explosion was a dull asterisk thump asterisk followed by a wall of pressure. She didn't wait to see if it worked. She ran back to the shack, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. 48%. The helicopter was circling lower now, the downdraft threatening to rip the roof off the shack. She could see the door gunner prepping the M134 minigun. They were done playing. They were going to level the building. Elena looked at the terminal. She looked at the cables. She knew what she had to do. The dark competence that had made her a legend was telling her there was only one way to ensure the data survived. She had to stay with the signal. If she pulled the tablet now, the handshake would break and the file would be corrupted. She sat down on the floor, her back against the metal rack. She took a breath, the first deep breath she'd taken since the crash. It tasted like dust and destiny. "Key," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. "I'm sorry." The first burst from the minigun hit the roof. It sounded like a giant zipper being undone. The wood disintegrated, the heavy rounds punching through the ceiling and floor like they were made of paper. Elena curled into a ball, shielding the tablet with her body. Dust choked her. A splinter the size of a finger sliced across her cheek, blood hot and fast. She didn't move. 62%. The building groaned, the structural supports beginning to fail. Another burst of fire chewed through the front wall, the rounds missing her by inches. The heat was incredible, the friction of the bullets igniting the dry wood. The shack was on fire. "Keep going," she prayed. "Just keep going." Through the hole in the wall, she saw the little bird hover, its nose dipping as it prepared for a final, lethal pass. She saw the pilot's face, illuminated by the cockpit lights. He looked like any other pilot she'd ever served with, young, focused, doing his job. He didn't know he was about to kill a ghost. 75%. A shadow moved in the doorway. It was the man from the SUV. He was covered in dust, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained with blood. He held a submachine gun, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "You really are extraordinary, Elena," he said, raising the weapon. "A shame." "You missed a detail," Elena said. The man paused, his finger tightening on the trigger. "What detail?" "The acoustic deterrent at the wellhead," she said, her voice barely a whisper over the roar of the fire. "I didn't just find it. I recorded the frequency." She hit a key on the tablet. From the rusted dishes outside, a sound erupted that wasn't a sound. It was a physical wave of high-frequency vibration, a scream that existed just outside the human range of hearing, but was designed to shatter the nervous systems of anything with an inner ear. It was the same tech she'd used to track the vultures. The man in the doorway screamed, dropping his weapon and clutching his head as his equilibrium vanished. Outside, the little bird jerked violently as the pilot's brain was flooded with the agonizing noise. The helicopter spun, its tail rotor clipping a power line. Sparks showered the desert like 4th of July fireworks. 89%. The fire was roaring now, the heat blistering the skin on Elena's arms. The smoke was a thick, black curtain. She was coughing, her lungs burning, but she didn't let go of the tablet. She watched the blue bar. 94%, 97%, 99%, asterisk upload complete. Asterisk she didn't wait for the confirmation. She grabbed the tablet, rolled under the terminal rack, and kicked open the small maintenance hatch she'd spotted earlier, a crawl space that led to the cooling tunnels beneath the station. She fell into the darkness just as the roof of the shack collapsed in a roar of flame and falling timber. The tunnel was narrow, cramped, and smelled of decades of neglect. Elena crawled on her hands and knees, the heat from above pressing down on her like a physical weight. She didn't know where the tunnel led. She didn't care. She just kept moving, her fingers digging into the dirt, her mind a blank slate of survival. She emerged 50 yards away, in a gully filled with tumbleweeds. She lay there for a long time, watching the shack burn. The little bird had managed to stabilize but was limping back toward the horizon, its electronics fried by the frequency blast. The men on the ground were gone, likely retreated to the secondary recovery point. She was alone in the desert. Again. But this time, the weight in her pocket was different. It wasn't just a tablet, it was a bomb. She had sent the file to a dead man's switch server she'd set up years ago, a repository of every anomaly she'd ever found, every grain that hadn't sat right. The moment she'd hit send, an email had been dispatched to 3 major news outlets and a contact she had at the Senate Intelligence Committee. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It wasn't the silence of the desert, it was the silence of a world that was about to change. She stood up, her body screaming in protest. Her flight suit was torn, her face was a mask of blood and soot, and she was pretty sure her left foot was broken. She looked toward the east, where the first hint of gray was beginning to touch the horizon. Dawn was coming. She began to walk. She didn't go back to the base. She didn't go back to her life. She walked toward the highway, toward the world that didn't know her name but was about to learn her truth. She thought about her father's workshop. She thought about the smell of cedar and the way he would run his thumb over a finished joint, checking for the gap. "There's always a gap, Elena," he would say. "Your job is to make sure it doesn't break the house." She had found the gap. She had seen the knot. And she had done the only thing a carpenter's daughter knew how to do. She had cut it out. 2 hours later, she reached a small, dusty truck stop on the edge of the 95. The air smelled of diesel and cheap coffee. A few truckers sat inside, their faces illuminated by the neon open sign. Elena walked to the counter, her movements slow and deliberate. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that said *Marge*, looked at her and gasped. "Honey, what happened to you?" "Car accident," Elena said, her voice cracking. "I just need a phone." "Of course, sweetie, here." Marge handed over a cordless phone. Elena dialed a number she had memorized 10 years ago. It wasn't the Air Force. It wasn't JAG. "Dad," she said when the voice answered. "Elena, is that you? It's 4 in the morning, honey." "I know," she said, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the soot on her cheek. I'm coming home, Dad. I'm going to need the workshop. What's wrong? You sound different. I just finished a job, she said, and I think I'm done with the grain for a while. She hung up the phone and sat on a vinyl stool. She ordered a cup of black coffee. As she waited, she looked at the television mounted in the corner. The news was just starting. Asterisk breaking news. Massive data breach at major defense contractor. Sources say internal documents reveal widespread corruption in drone program. Asterisk, Elena took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, bitter, and tasted like the truth. She sat there as the sun rose over the Nevada desert, a lone figure in a torn flight suit, watching the world burn from the inside out. She was tired. She was broken. She was a criminal in the eyes of the men she had once respected. But as she looked at her reflection in the darkened window, she didn't see a victim. She saw a woman who had finally closed the delay. She saw the ghost who had come back to life. The door to the truck stop opened, and a young man in an Air Force flight suit stepped in. He looked lost, his eyes red from lack of sleep. It was Key. He saw her, and for a second he didn't move. Then he walked over and sat on the stool next to her. "They let me go," he whispered. "They said the investigation was closed. They said you died in the crash." Elena didn't look at him. She stared at the TV. "I did. What do we do now, Vane?" Elena finally turned her head. She looked at the boy from Chicago, the one she had promised to protect. She saw the fear in him, but she also saw the grain. He was stronger than he looked. "Now," she said, her voice a low, steady hum, "we build something new." She reached out and put her hand over his. Her fingers were steady. The world was still spinning, the politics were still churning, and the men in gray suits were likely already regrouping. But in that small, dusty truck stop in the middle of nowhere, there was a moment of pure, earned peace. Elena Vance, the girl who could see what no one else could, closed her eyes and let the warmth of the coffee and the weight of the moment anchor her. She had lost everything she thought she wanted, her career, her status, her safety. But she had found the one thing she had never known was missing. She had found herself. And as the first light of the new day spilled across the counter, she knew that whatever happened next, she would be ready. Because the grain might be twisted and the world might be broken, but she was the one with the tool. And she wasn't done cutting. The immediate aftermath was a blur of silence and movement. No sirens came for them. No black SUVs pulled into the parking lot. The breach was so total, the exposure so deep, that the institution had done the only thing it could do when faced with a catastrophic failure. It had frozen. Thorne was gone. Holloway was in a closed-door session with the Joint Chiefs, and Elena Vance was sitting in a truck stop, drinking coffee with a man who was officially mourning her. The texture of the moment was surreal, a thin layer of normalcy over a chasm of chaos. She could feel the vibration of the world shifting, a low-frequency hum that only she could hear. "Vane," Key said, his voice a little stronger. "Look." He pointed to the screen. A picture of the architect appeared. Not the grainy thermal feed, but a clear professional headshot. Asterisk Dr. Julian Vane, former lead scientist at Apex Solutions. Asterisk Elena stared at the name. Asterisk Vane. Asterisk she looked at her hands. She looked at the tablet on the counter. "He was my uncle," she whispered. Key stared at her. "You didn't know? My father. He hasn't spoken to his brother in 20 years, she said. "He told me Julian died in a car accident. He told me he was a man who lost his way." The realization was the final piece of the puzzle. The architect hadn't just been a whistleblower, he had been a man trying to reach the only person he thought could understand the grain. He had been trying to reach her, and she had been the one to hunt him down. The cost was no longer theoretical. It was personal. It was a debt that could never be repaid. Elena stood up. She felt the weight of it, the crushing, industrial pressure of the truth, but she didn't break. She straightened her torn flight suit, wiped the blood from her cheek, and looked at the door. "Let's go, Key," she said. "Where?" "To Washington," she said. "I have a house to fix." They walked out into the bright, unforgiving light of the Nevada morning. Behind them, the truck stop hummed with the sound of a world that was still trying to catch up. Elena Vance didn't look back. She walked toward the car Key had parked at the edge of the lot, her shadow long and sharp on the sand. The reckoning was coming. The long aftermath was just beginning. But as she got into the driver's seat and turned the key, Elena felt a strange, cold clarity. She knew the grain. she knew the knot, and she knew exactly where to strike. The story wasn't over. It had just moved into the light. And for the first time in her life, Elena Vance wasn't watching the world through a lens. She was standing right in the center of it, and she was the one holding the fire. The sink in the Tanapa motel was stained with a ring of rust that looked like a topographical map, and Elena Vance watched her own blood swirl into the center of it at exactly 0415 on a Tuesday morning. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of sulfur, a common reality in the high desert of Nevada. But to Elena, it felt like the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. She dipped a rough, thin towel into the basin and pressed it against the gash on her temple. The sting was sharp, a localized fire that cut through the foggy, rhythmic pulsing of her concussion. In the room behind her, the television was muted, casting a flickering, rhythmic blue light over the beige wallpaper and the two twin beds that smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial-grade detergent. Key was sitting on the edge of the other bed, his head in his hands, his flight suit unzipped to the waist. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the truck stop. He was still processing the fact that, according to the scrolling ticker on the bottom of the news feed, he was currently listed as missing and presumed decased, following a training mishap in the Nevada Test and Training Range. Elena pulled the towel away and looked at herself in the cracked mirror. Her face was a landscape of bruises, deep purples, and sickly yellows, and the grain she usually used to navigate the world was fractured. When she looked at the room, she didn't just see furniture. She saw vectors of entry, the structural weakness of the door frame, the thermal signature of the heater. But it was stuttering. The concussion had introduced a delay in her own internal processing, a lag that felt more terrifying than the men who had been shooting at her 4 hours ago. She was a woman built on precision, on the 1.5-second reality of the kill chain, and now she was operating in a world where her own mind was drifting. She reached for the small plastic bottle of aspirin on the counter, her fingers trembling just enough to make the plastic rattle. It was a small sound, but in the silence of the motel, it sounded like a structural failure. 600 miles to the east, in a windowless room deep within the earring of the Pentagon, the machinery of the United States Air Force was beginning to grind with a terrifying, silent efficiency. General Marcus Holloway sat at the head of a mahogany table that had seen the planning of 3 wars, but the look on his face suggested he was currently losing a 4th. Before him sat a red folder, the kind that never left the building, and a tablet displaying the same news footage Elena was watching in Tanapa. The leak was out. The dead man's switch Elena had triggered had bypassed every firewall the Air Force had spent billions constructing. It wasn't just that the data was public. It was the asterisk way asterisk it was public. It was formatted as a series of mission logs, targeting packets, and internal memos from Apex Solutions that clearly outlined a systematic program of extrajudicial killings disguised as drone strikes. The room was filled with men and women in uniform, the air thick with the smell of expensive coffee and the ozone of high-end air purifiers. There was a brigadier general from JAG, an undersecretary of defense, and a colonel from the Office of Special Investigations who looked like he hadn't slept since the previous fiscal year. They weren't talking about justice. They weren't talking about the lives lost in the valley or the architect Elena had been forced to kill. They were talking about containment. They were discussing the narrative. To the institution, Elena Vance wasn't a hero or a whistleblower. She was a system error that needed to be patched. The conversation moved with a cold, procedural rhythm, the language stripped of all human weight. They used words like mitigation, reputational risk, and personnel recovery. Holloway finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that silenced the room. "The pilot," he said, not using Elena's name. "The report says she died in the crash. Why is there a grainy cell phone video of a woman matching her description at a truck stop 3 hours after the incident?" The OSI colonel cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The recovery team at the relay station encountered resistance, sir. There was an atmospheric acoustic event that compromised their equilibrium. By the time they recovered, the subject had exfiltrated. We are currently scrubbing all transit footage from the 95 corridor. If she's alive, she's a ghost. But she's a ghost with a high-capacity data terminal. Holloway looked at the red folder. He knew what was inside. He had been the one to sign the authorization for the Apex contract. He had believed, in the way men of his rank often do, that the ends justified the messy, gray area means. He had thought the AI targeting algorithms were a way to save American lives by removing the hesitation of the human pilot. He hadn't realized, or had chosen not to see, that the algorithms were being tuned by a corporation with its own list of enemies. Now, the grain of his own career was beginning to splinter. He could feel the eyes of the JAG officers on him, the silent calculation of who would be the first to jump ship when the subpoenas started flying. The institution was protecting itself, and as the man at the top of the local chain, Holloway was starting to realize he might be the part the system decided was expendable. Back in the motel room, the silence was finally broken by the sound of a phone vibrating on the nightstand. It wasn't Elena's. It was the burner phone she had taken from the man in the suit. She picked it up, her movements slow and deliberate. There was no caller ID, just a string of encrypted digits. She didn't answer. She watched the screen until it went dark, then she walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back just a fraction of an inch. The parking lot was empty except for a rusted Ford F-150 and the silver sedan Key had used to find her. The sun was just starting to bleed over the horizon, a bruised orange light that made the desert look like a foreign planet. "They're not coming for us yet," Elena said, her voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off. "They're still trying to figure out how much I sent." Key looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "It doesn't matter how much you sent, Vane. We're done. My mom, she's going to get a notification. A chaplain is going to knock on her door in Chicago and tell her I'm dead. Do you have any idea what that does to a person?" Elena turned away from the window. The cold control she had maintained for years felt like a suit of armor that was suddenly 10 sizes too small. She felt the weight of Key's life, the weight of her father's disappointment, and the weight of the man she had killed, her uncle, a man she hadn't known was her own blood until it was too late. The personal cost wasn't a single event. It was a rising tide, a slow-motion drowning. She looked at Key, and for the first time the mask slipped. Just for a second. Her lip trembled, and she had to clench her jaw so hard her teeth ached to keep from breaking. "I know," she said, and the words cost her everything. "I know what it does. But if we go back now, if we let them tell the story, then the architect died for nothing. And those people in the valley, the ones the AI flagged because they were inconvenient, they'll just be numbers on a spreadsheet. Is that what you want? To be the guy who went back to his desk and pretended the grain was straight?" Key stared at her, and in that moment, the relationship between them shifted. He wasn't the junior officer anymore, and she wasn't his instructor. They were two people standing in the wreckage of their lives, holding onto the only thing they had left, a truth that no one wanted to hear. Key stood up, his movement stiff. He walked over to the small table and picked up the tablet. "What's the next step?" he asked. "We need a secure line," Elena said, her voice regaining its steady, industrial hum. "Not the internet, not the satellite. We need the old copper. There's a switching station in Beatty. If I can get in there, I can bypass the NSA's digital filters and send a direct packet to the Senate Intelligence Committee. I have a name, Senator Miriam Vance." Key froze. "Vance, is she?" "My aunt," Elena said, her voice flat. "The one person in my family who didn't let the grain break her. She's the one who told me that sometimes the only way to fix a house is to tear it down to the studs." The institutional response was now moving into its second phase. The scrub. At Creech Air Force Base, the lockers belonging to Captain Elena Vance and Lieutenant Marcus Key were being emptied by men in plain clothes. Their hard drives were being pulled, their personal files scanned for any hint of instability or radicalization. This was the procedural cruelty of the military. When you betrayed the institution didn't just punish you, it erased you. They were building a biography of a breakdown. They found Elena's history of migraines, the ones she had hidden from the flight surgeon, and they turned them into a narrative of chronic neurological instability. They found Key's gaming history and turned it into a lack of focus. In a small office in the basement of the Pentagon, a young JAG major named Sarah Jenkins was looking at Elena's service record. She was the one tasked with drafting the preliminary findings for the line of duty investigation. She had been told this was a slam-dunk case of pilot error and mental health crisis. But as she scrolled through the flight logs, something caught her eye. She was an analyst by trade before she went to law school, and she knew how to look for patterns. She saw the 5-second delay. She saw how Elena Vance had consistently operated within the gap. And then she saw the mission logs from the day of the crash. Jenkins leaned back in her chair, the light from the monitor reflecting in her glasses. The smell of the office, stale paper and toner, suddenly felt suffocating. The logs showed that the drone hadn't been triggered by the pilot. It had been triggered by an external override from a server at Apex Solutions. The kill hadn't been Elena's, it had been the system's. Jenkins looked at the door to her office, then back at the screen. She knew what her job was. Her job was to protect the Air Force, but she also knew that the report she was supposed to write was a lie. She sat there for a long time, the silence of the basement pressing in on her, realizing that she was now part of the machinery. And the machinery was designed to crush people like Elena Vance. The reckoning for the authority figures was happening in smaller, more private ways. Colonel Thorne sat in his kitchen in a quiet suburb of Las Vegas, the sun streaming through the windows, highlighting the dust on the counter. He had been sent on administrative leave an hour ago. He knew what that meant. It meant he was the firewall. If the leak became too big to contain, he would be the one sacrificed to protect the generals. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed the orders for the gray suits to recover the file. He had thought he was a patriot. He had thought he was doing the hard work that allowed people to sleep at night. But as he watched the news, he saw the face of the architect, and he saw the face of Elena Vance. He remembered Elena from the academy. She had been the one who never missed a detail, the one who saw the world with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. He had respected her, and now he had tried to kill her. The human weight of that realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had let himself become a cog, and in doing so, he had lost the ability to tell the difference between a target and a human being. He reached for his phone, but then he stopped. Who would he call? There was no one left in the system who would listen. He was already a ghost, just like Elena. In Beatty, the air smelled of sagebrush and ozone. Elena and Key stood outside the chain-link fence of the switching station, the wind whipping at their hair. Elena looked at the facility with her dark competence, her mind automatically mapping the security cameras and the pressure sensors. She felt the cold metal of the wire cutters in her hand, the weight of it familiar and grounding. She looked at Key, who was holding a signal jammer she'd jury-rigged from the truck stop electronics. "If we do this," Key said, his voice barely a whisper, "there's no going back. They'll charge us with espionage. They'll call us traitors." "They're already calling us dead," Elena said. "I'd rather be a live traitor than a dead lie." She moved with a quiet, lethal grace, her body ignoring the pain from the crash as the mission took over. This was the stray ordinary, a hidden capability that the Air Force had seen but never truly understood. It wasn't just that she could fly. It was that she could exist in the high-stress environment of a tactical breach as if she were sitting in a quiet room reading a book. She slipped through the fence, her movements synchronized with the sweep of the security cameras. Key followed her, his breath hitching in his chest, his eyes wide. He saw her in a way no one else ever had, not as a pilot, but as a force of nature. Inside the station, the air was cool and filled with the hum of thousands of miles of copper wire. Elena found the primary trunk line, the one that fed into the government's secure backbone. She didn't have a computer anymore. She had the tablet, and she had a direct connect interface she'd salvaged from the SUV. She began the hot wire process, her fingers moving with a blur of speed. She wasn't just sending data now, she was opening a two-way door. "Come on, Miriam," she whispered. "Answer the red line." The tablet blinked. A connection was established. A single line of text appeared on the screen, *ID verified. Proceed, Elena. Elena felt a surge of hope, a small, fragile thing that bloomed in the center of her chest. She began the upload of the deep file, the one that contained the source code for the Apex algorithms. This was the smoking gun. This was the evidence that the AI was being used to target American citizens on domestic soil, the ultimate betrayal of the military's oath. The progress bar began to crawl, 10%, 20%. Suddenly, the lights in the station flickered. The hum of the wires changed frequency, a low, ominous throb that vibrated in Elena's teeth. "They found the tap," Key said, pointing to a monitor on the wall. "They're rerouting the signal from Nellie's. They're going to fry the junction." "I need 3 minutes," Elena said, her voice hard. "Just 3 minutes." Outside, the sound of a heavy-lift helicopter began to rattle the windows. It wasn't a little bird this time. It was a pave hawk, the kind used for combat search and rescue or for the high-intensity apprehension of high-value targets. The institution was no longer trying to hide. They were coming with the full weight of their power. Elena didn't look up. She focused on the bar. 45%. "Key, get the jammer to the roof," she ordered. "If you can disrupt their terrain following radar, they won't be able to drop the fast ropes. You have to buy me the time." Key didn't hesitate. He grabbed the jammer and ran for the stairs, his boots clattering on the metal grating. He was no longer the kid from Chicago. He was the partner who saw her clearly, the one who was willing to lose everything to give her those 3 minutes. Elena sat on the cold floor, her back against the terminal, the blue light of the tablet illuminating her bruised face. She could hear the helicopter overhead, the downwash shaking the building, the sound of the rotor blades like the heartbeat of a giant. She felt the cost in that moment, the realization that even if she won, she would never fly again. She would never sit in the cockpit of a Reaper and feel the sun on the canopy. She would never have the career she had worked for since she was a little girl in Amak. She was destroying the thing she loved to save the thing she believed in. 60%. The door to the switching station was blown off its hinges with a deafening asterisk boom asterisk. Smoke and dust flooded the room. Elena didn't flinch. She pulled her M9, but she didn't aim at the door. She aimed at the primary power transformer. "Stop!" A voice shouted through the smoke. It was Thorn. He was wearing a tactical vest, his face pale and eyes wild. He wasn't holding a weapon, he was holding a radio. "Elena, stop. They're going to level the building. They've authorized a kinetic strike." Elena looked at him through the haze. The dark competence was in full control now. She saw the man she had once respected, and she saw the fear in him. He wasn't there to kill her. He was there to try and save his own soul. "Then tell them to hit it," Elena said, her voice steady and clear over the roar of the helicopter. "The data is already in the backbone. The moment this building goes, the signal bounces to 12 different nodes. You can't stop the grain, Thorn. It's already been cut." 75%? Thorn looked at the tablet, then back at her. He could hear the pilot of the Pave Hawk on his radio, asking for final clearance. He knew the protocol. He knew that in 30 seconds, a Hellfire missile would turn the station into a crater. "Give me the tablet," Thorn pleaded. "I can tell them I recovered it. I can get you out of here." "No," Elena said. "You don't get to be the hero now. You chose the system. I chose the truth." 85%. On the roof, Key was standing in the hurricane of the helicopter's downdraft, holding the jammer high like a torch. The Pave Hawk was hovering 50 feet above him, the door gunners looking down, their weapons cold. They weren't firing. They were waiting for the word. Key looked into the cockpit, and for a second he saw the pilot. He saw the hesitation. He saw the same doubt he had felt. 95%? In the Pentagon, General Holloway sat in front of a screen that showed the thermal signature of the BD switching station. His hand was hovering over the secure phone. All he had to do was say the word. One word, and the problem of Elena Vance would be solved permanently. The institution would be protected. The secret would stay in the red folder. He looked at the JAG major, Sarah Jenkins, who was standing in the doorway of the command center. She was holding a physical copy of the flight logs. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him. It was a look of pure, unadulterated judgment. It was the look of the grain finally catching up to him. Holloway's hand trembled. The silence in the room was absolute. 99%? Elena Vance closed her eyes. She felt the vibration of the missile lock, the high-pitched whine that only a pilot's ears could detect. She thought of her father. She thought of the smell of cedar in the workshop. She thought of the 5 seconds it took for a world to end. Upload complete. The tablet chimed. Elena opened her eyes and looked at Thorn. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The dark competence was gone, replaced by a quiet, devastating peace. She had done it. She had closed the gap. The missile didn't fire. The helicopter overhead flared and began to climb, the roar of the rotors fading as it turned back toward the east. The silence that followed was heavy, a thick, industrial quiet that felt like the weight of a mountain. Thorn dropped his radio. He slumped against the wall, his head in his hands. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "They stood down," he whispered. Why did they stand down? Because the senator just called the Secretary of Defense, a voice said from the doorway. It was Major Sarah Jenkins. She was covered in the dust of the desert, her uniform rumpled, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She walked into the room, stepping over the debris, and looked at Elena. "Captain Vance," she said, her voice formal, "you are under arrest for the unauthorized access of a government facility and the theft of classified data." Elena stood up, her body screaming in protest. She looked at Jenkins, and for the first time in years she felt like she was being seen, not as a pilot, not as a ghost, but as a person. "I know," Elena said. She held out her hands, her wrists together. Jenkins didn't reach for her handcuffs. She just stood there, looking at the woman who had broken the Air Force to save it. "The senator is on her way," Jenkins said, "and the attorney general. It's going to be a long night, Captain." "I've had worse," Elena said. Outside, Key came down from the roof, his face streaked with soot and tears. He saw Elena standing there, and he stopped. The two of them looked at each other across the wreckage of the room. There were no words. There was just the shared knowledge of what they had done and what it was going to cost them. The personal cost was arriving in full now. Elena could feel the career she had built, the identity she had cherished, slipping away. She was no longer vain. She was no longer a pilot. She was a defendant. She was a headline. She was a woman who had seen the grain and had been forced to cut herself out of the wood. As they led her out of the building and toward the waiting subs, Elena looked at the horizon. The sun was fully up now, casting long, dramatic shadows across the Nevada desert. She felt the wind on her face, the smell of sagebrush and rain-on dust. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She wasn't the same woman who had woken up in the cockpit of a Reaper 48 hours ago. She was older, more broken, and infinitely more dangerous. Because she now knew exactly what she was capable of. The institutional machinery was still grinding, but the sound had changed. It was no longer the sound of a smooth, efficient engine. It was the sound of a system that had hit a snag, a piece of grain that wouldn't break. Elena Vance sat in the back of the SUV, the cool air of the AC hitting her bruised face. She looked at the tablet in Jenkins' hand. The data was out. The truth was moving. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, just for a moment. She had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. And as the car began to move, heading back toward the world she had changed, Elena knew one thing for certain. She was ready for the reckoning. The drive back toward Las Vegas was silent, the kind of silence that exists in the eye of a hurricane. They passed the wreck of the SUV on the highway, a black, scorched skeleton that looked like a warning. Elena didn't look at it. She watched the desert floor, the way the light hit the quartz, the way the shadows of the clouds moved across the mountains. She was looking for the patterns, the way she always had. She saw a hawk circling high above, a tiny speck of black against the blue. It was hunting, using the thermals to stay aloft, watching the world with a clarity that she recognized. "What happens now?" Key asked from the front seat. He was handcuffed to the door handle, but he didn't seem to care. He was looking at Elena in the rearview mirror. "Now," Elena said, her voice a low, steady hum, "we wait for the lawyers." "And the medals?" Key asked, a hint of his old humor returning, though it was dark and jagged. Elena didn't smile. "There are no medals for what we did, Key. There are only consequences." She looked at her hands, the grease from the terminal still under her fingernails. She felt the weight of the silver oak leaf on her shoulder, the rank she had earned through a decade of discipline and sacrifice. She reached up and unpinned it, the metal cool against her palm. She looked at it for a long moment, then she dropped it onto the floor of the SUV. The cost wasn't just her career. It was the person she had been. She was no longer a part of the institution. She was the one who had seen its heart and found it wanting. As they approached the outskirts of the city, the neon lights of the strip began to twinkle in the distance, a gaudy, artificial glow that felt like an insult to the desert. The SUV didn't head for the base. It headed for the federal building downtown. The institution was ready for her. There were banks of cameras, a sea of reporters, and a phalanx of security guards. The world was waiting to see the woman who had broken the silence. Elena Vance stepped out of the car, her head held high, her flight suit torn and stained with blood. She didn't hide her face. She didn't look away from the cameras. She walked through the crowd with a dark competence that silenced the room. She wasn't performing her pain. She wasn't begging for validation. She was a woman who knew what she knew, and she was ready to stand by it. As she entered the building, she saw a woman standing by the elevator. She was older, with silver hair and a sharp, intelligent face. She was wearing a dark suit and a string of pearls. It was Senator Miriam Vance. The two women looked at each other. There was no hug. There was no emotional outburst. There was just a single, earned moment of recognition. "You found the gap, Elena," the senator said, her voice quiet and steady. "I found the knot, Aunt Miriam," Elena said. "Then let's go fix the house," the senator said. The elevator doors closed and the world outside vanished. Elena Vance took a deep breath, the first one that didn't hurt. She was inside the machinery now, but this time she wasn't a cog. She was the tool. The hearing was set for the following morning. The charges were still being finalized, but the institution was already beginning to retreat. The data Elena had sent was too specific, too devastating to ignore. The Secretary of Defense had resigned. Apex Solutions stock was in a freefall, and the architect, Dr. Julian Vane, was being hailed as a martyr for the truth. Elena sat in a small, windowless holding cell, the air smelling of antiseptic and old coffee. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. She thought about the 5-second delay. She thought about the way the world looked through the lens of a reaper. She realized that she had been living in that delay for a long time, waiting for the moment when she could finally act. The moment had come and gone. The trigger had been pulled. And as she sat in the silence of the cell, Elena Vance realized that for the first time in her life, the grain was finally straight. She closed her eyes and saw the desert. She saw the mountains. She saw the hawk circling in the blue. She was a ghost no longer. She was a woman standing in the light. And the reckoning was only just beginning. The SUV hit a pothole on the outskirts of Beatty, a jarring thud that sent a spike of lightning through Elena's concussed skull. And for a split second, the red digital numbers on the tablet in Major Jenkins' lap were the only things keeping her from drifting back into the black. The interior of the Suburban smelled of ozone, gun oil, and the chemical sharp scent of a brand-new upholstery cleaner that couldn't quite mask the underlying stink of sweat and desperation. Major Sarah Jenkins, the JAG officer who had just effectively ended Elena's career with a set of handcuffs and a quiet declaration of arrest, sat with her spine perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on the unfolding data on the screen. Outside the window, the desert was a blurred smear of ochre and dull green, the morning sun now high enough to turn the horizon into a shimmering, liquid line. Elena looked down at her wrists. They weren't in zip ties anymore. Jenkins had replaced them with standard-issue steel cuffs that felt heavy and cold, a physical weight that anchored her to the reality of her new status. She was no longer Captain Elena Vance, the prodigy of the 432nd Wing. She was a national security asset currently in the process of being neutralized. In the front seat, Marcus Key was staring out the window, his reflection in the glass showing a man who looked like he had aged a decade in 2 days. He hadn't said a word since they'd left the switching station. He didn't have to. The silence between them was a physical thing, a shared understanding of the cliff they had just jumped off. "The server in Fort Meade is trying to initiate a remote wipe," Jenkins said, her voice devoid of emotion, the tone of a woman reading a grocery list. "But the senator's office has already mirrored the drive. You timed the upload to the millisecond, Captain. If you'd been 3 seconds slower, the encryption would have scrambled the Apex source code beyond recovery." Elena didn't look at her. She watched a lone telephone pole flash by, then another. "Precision is the only thing that matters in the gap, Major. You know that. That's why you looked at the logs. Jenkins finally turned her head, her gaze sharp behind her glasses. I looked at the logs because the numbers didn't add up. I don't like it when the numbers don't add up. It suggests a structural failure in the truth. She paused, her thumb tracing the edge of the tablet. But you should understand something. Knowing the truth and being able to survive it are two very different things. The Air Force is a living organism, Elena. When it encounters a pathogen, even a well-intentioned one, it tries to kill it. You aren't just a pilot anymore. You're the infection. I'm the immune response, Elena said. The SUV slowed as they approached the gate of Creech Air Force Base. This wasn't the triumphant return of a hero. This was a tactical delivery. The guards at the gate didn't salute. They stood with their hands on their rifles, their eyes scanning the interior of the vehicle with a cold, professional detachment that Elena had once admired. Now, it felt like being watched by a machine. They were waved through into a cordoned-off area behind Hangar 3, far away from the flight line, where the Reapers sat in their climate-controlled stalls, waiting for their next set of coordinates. When the door opened, the heat hit Elena like a physical blow. It was 102 degrees, the kind of dry, kiln-like heat that sucked the moisture out of your pores before you even knew you were sweating. She was led out of the car and toward a nondescript cinder-block building that had no windows and a single reinforced steel door. There were men in suits waiting for them, not the gray suits from the desert, but the ones from the Office of Special Investigations, men with short haircuts and eyes that looked like they had been scrubbed of all human empathy. They took Key first. Elena watched him go, his shoulders slumped, his flight suit stained with the dust of the valley. He didn't look back. She wanted to say something, to tell him that it was worth it, but the words felt heavy and useless in the desert air. She was led in the opposite direction, down a long, fluorescent-lit hallway that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. The dark competence that had carried her through the last 48 hours was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a deep, bone-settling exhaustion. The room they put her in was small, maybe 10 by 10. It had a table, 2 chairs, and a mirror that she knew was a two-way. They didn't take her handcuffs off. They didn't offer her water. They just left her there. Elena sat down, the metal chair cold against her legs. She closed her eyes and tried to find the grain. She tried to visualize the 5-second delay, the space where she was most comfortable. But the world was no longer a series of vectors and targeting packets. It was a mess of consequences. She thought about her father's workshop in Amac, the way the cedar smelled when it was freshly planed, the way he would run his hand over the wood to find the hidden knots. He always said you couldn't fight the wood, you had to work with it, or it would splinter and ruin everything. She realized now that she hadn't worked with the wood. She had taken an axe to the whole structure. The door opened an hour later. She expected a lawyer or perhaps an interrogator. Instead, it was General Marcus Halloway. He didn't look like the man on the news. He looked tired. His uniform was impeccable, the stars on his shoulders catching the harsh light, but the skin around his eyes was sagging, and his hands were trembling slightly as he pulled out the chair across from her. He didn't sit down immediately. He walked to the corner of the room, looking at the mirror, then turned back to her. "The senator is currently on the floor of the Senate," Halloway said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "She's reading the apex targeting logs into the congressional record. Do you have any idea what that means, Captain Vance?" "It means the truth is no longer a classified secret, sir," Elena said, her voice steady despite the pulsing in her head. "It means you've destroyed a 10-year, $50 billion program." Halloway snapped, his face reddening. "It means you've compromised the intelligence-gathering capabilities of the United States in 4 different theaters. It means you've handed our enemies a roadmap of our internal decision-making processes. You think you're a whistleblower? You're a wrecking ball." Elena looked him in the eye. She didn't flinch. "The architect was targeting American citizens, General. The algorithms were being tuned by a private corporation to eliminate political obstacles under the guise of counterterrorism. I didn't destroy the program. The program was a rot. I just pulled back the drywall." Halloway sat down then, leaning forward until he was inches from her face. The smell of his cologne, something expensive and woodsy, clashed with the antiseptic smell of the room. "The world is a messy place, Elena. We make choices so people like your father can sleep in peace. We operate in the gray so the rest of the country can live in the white. You didn't just expose a rot. You exposed the machinery that keeps us safe. If the machinery requires us to kill our own to stay safe, then the machinery is broken, Elena said. And you know it. That's why you didn't fire the missile in Beatty. You could have ended me right there. You could have wiped the signal. But you didn't. Why? Holloway stared at her for a long time, the silence stretching out until it felt like it was going to snap. The controlled rage in him was cooling, replaced by something that looked remarkably like defeat. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. Because for 1 second, he whispered, I remembered what it felt like to be a pilot. Before the stars, before the politics. I remembered the code, and I realized that if I killed you to protect the lie, I'd be proving you right. He stood up, his movement stiff. The JAGs are coming in next. They're going to offer you a deal. If you sign a non-disclosure agreement and agree to a quiet medical discharge, they'll drop the espionage charges. You can go home. You can disappear. And if I don't, then they'll bury you, Holloway said. They'll move the trial to a closed military court. They'll use the national security shield to keep the evidence out of the public eye. You'll spend the rest of your life in a cell at Leavenworth, and the world will forget your name in a week. He walked to the door, his hand on the handle. Think about it, Elena. You've done enough. You've saved the architect's legacy. You've given the senator her ammunition. Don't throw your life away for a pride you can't afford. He left, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Elena sat in the silence, the weight of the cost pressing down on her. She thought about the deal. It was the easy way out. She could go back to Washington. She could sit in her father's workshop and breathe the cedar dust. She could live a quiet life, a ghost of the woman she had been. But she knew what would happen to Key. They wouldn't offer him the same deal. They would use him as the lever to keep her quiet. And she knew what would happen to the truth. It would be categorized, filed away, and eventually the gray suits would find a way to rebuild the machine under a different name. The door opened again. This time it was Sarah Jenkins. She was carrying a folder and a tape recorder. She set them on the table and looked at Elena's handcuffs. Without a word, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a key, and unlocked them. The relief was instantaneous, a rush of blood back into Elena's hands that made her fingers tingle and ache. She rubbed her wrists, the red marks of the steel vivid against her pale skin. The general's offer is off the table, Jenkins said, her voice quiet. Elena looked up, a cold knot forming in her stomach. What happened? The senator just released the second packet, Jenkins said, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of her mouth. The one you hidden in the subdirectory of the Apex server. The one that contains the personal emails of the board members of Apex and 3 sitting members of the House Armed Services Committee. The deal was contingent on containment. There is no containment anymore. The fire is out of the house and moving through the woods. Jenkins sat down and pushed the folder across the table. This is your statement of charges: espionage, theft of government property, unauthorized access to a secure network, violation of the UCMJ on 12 different counts. She looked at the tape recorder, then back at Elena. But there's a problem. The Secretary of the Air Force just resigned. The Attorney General has opened a federal civil rights investigation into the Apex contract. And the public has decided you're a hero. I don't want to be a hero, Elena said, her voice cracking for the first time. I just wanted to do my job. Your job is over, Elena, Jenkins said, and for the first time, there was a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. Regardless of how this ends, you will never fly for the United States Air Force again. You will never hold a security clearance. You are a persona non grata in the world you spent your life building. That is the cost of being right. I know, Elena said. She looked at the folder. Where is Key? He's been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, Jenkins said. The senator insisted on it. He's being processed for an administrative separation. He'll be out by the end of the week. He's going back to Chicago. Elena felt a surge of relief that made her lightheaded. Key was safe. That was the one thing she had needed. She could carry the rest. She could carry the weight of the charges, the weight of the career loss, the weight of the silence. The next 48 hours were a blur of procedural theater. Elena was moved from Creech to a federal holding facility in Las Vegas, a stark, glass and steel building that felt more like a corporate office than a prison. She was given a lawyer, a man named Miller who spoke in short, clipped sentences and smelled of peppermint. He told her she was a legal nightmare and a political unicorn. He told her the government was terrified of her because they couldn't figure out if she was a traitor or a saint. The hearing took place in a windowless room on the 5th floor. It wasn't a court-martial, not yet. It was an Article 32 hearing, the military's version of a grand jury. There were 3 officers on the panel, 2 colonels and a brigadier general, all of them men who looked like they had been carved out of granite. They sat behind a long mahogany table, the light reflecting off their medals. Elena sat at the defense table, wearing a clean flight suit Jenkins had brought her. She felt like a fraud in it. It was a costume now, a reminder of a life she no longer possessed. Behind her, in the small gallery, sat Senator Elena Vance. The senator didn't look at the panel. She looked at Elena, her face a mask of calm, professional resolve. The government's lead counsel was a man named Lieutenant Colonel Vance, no relation, a shark of a lawyer who spent 3 hours outlining Elena's betrayal. He showed the grainy footage of the switching station. He played the audio of the architect being killed, the sound of the gunshot echoing in the small room like a thunderclap. He spoke about orders, duty, and the sanctity of the chain of command. He painted Elena as a woman who had cracked under the pressure of the 1-5-second reality, a pilot who had let her personal morality override her military oath. When it was Elena's turn to speak, she didn't stand up. She sat in her chair, her hands folded on the table. She didn't look at the lawyers. She looked at the panel of officers. "I grew up in a wood shop," she began, her voice low and resonant, the sound of it filling the room. "My father taught me that the grain of a piece of wood tells you everything you need to know about its strength. If the grain is straight, the wood is strong. If there's a knot, that's where the break will happen. Every time." She leaned forward, her dark competence returning, the same focus she used when she was tracking a target through the lens of a reaper. "The Air Force taught me that the mission is the grain. We follow the orders because the orders are the truth. But what happens when the orders are the knot? What happens when the system you serve is being used to undermine the very thing you swore to protect?" She looked at the brigadier general in the center of the panel. "I didn't break the chain of command. The chain of command was already broken. It was being used to bypass the law. It was being used to kill people based on an algorithm designed by a corporation interested in profit, not protection. I saw the knot, sir, and I had a choice. I could follow the grain until the whole structure collapsed, or I could cut it out." She paused, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of her words. "I know what this costs. I know I'll never fly again. I know I'll probably spend years in a room like this, explaining myself to people who have already decided what I am. But I would do it again. I would do it every single time. Because if we lose the ability to tell the difference between a target and a human being, then we've already lost the war." She sat back, the human landing finally arriving. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't afraid. She was just a woman who had done her duty, and she was ready for whatever came next. The panel deliberated for 6 hours. During that time, Elena sat in a small anteroom with the senator. They didn't talk about the case. They talked about Amak. They talked about the smell of the pine trees in the summer and the way the river sounded in the spring. "You did good, Elena," Miriam said, her hand resting on Elena's arm. "Your father would have been proud." "He would have hated the handcuffs," Elena said, a ghost of a smile appearing. "He would have hated the lie more," Miriam replied. The verdict was not a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. The panel found that while Elena had technically violated the UCMJ, her actions were mitigated by the extraordinary circumstances of the illegal activity she uncovered. They recommended a general discharge under honorable conditions. It was a compromise, a way for the Air Force to save face while acknowledging that she was right. The espionage charges were dropped, buried under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements that Elena signed without hesitation. She didn't care about the secret. She cared about the truth being out. The institutional response was swift and surgical. Within 24 hours of the verdict, Elena Vance was no longer a member of the United States military. Her ID card was confiscated. Her flight logs were archived. Her name was removed from the duty roster at Creech. She was given a check for her remaining pay and a bus ticket to wherever she wanted to go. She walked out of the federal building at 4 in the afternoon. The heat was still there, but it felt different now. It didn't feel like a wait. It felt like the world. Key was waiting for her on the sidewalk. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, looking like just another civilian in the Las Vegas sprawl. He had a bag over his shoulder and a look on his face that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. It was a look of pure, unadulterated respect. "I'm heading to the airport," he said, his voice quiet. "My mom, she's waiting for me in Chicago. She still thinks I died in that crash." "Tell her you were just lost for a bit," Elena said. Key stepped forward and hugged her, a quick, fierce embrace that said everything their words never could. "You saved me, Vane, not just from the crash, from the machine. I don't know how to thank you for that." "Don't thank me," Elena said, pulling back. "Just live a life that's worth the cost. That's all I want." She watched him walk away, a young man with a second chance, until he disappeared into the crowd. She felt a pang of loneliness, a sharp, localized ache in the center of her chest, but it was followed by a sense of peace. She had done her job. She had brought him home. The senator had offered her a job in D.C., a position on her staff as a military advisor. It was a good offer, a way to stay in the fight, to use her extraordinary hidden capability to help fix the system from the inside. But Elena had turned it down. She wasn't ready for the city. She wasn't ready for the politics. She needed the quiet. She bought a used Jeep with a portion of her pay, a rugged, silver thing that reminded her of the desert. She packed the few belongings she had left: a photo of her father, her old flight jacket, the patches removed, and the small wooden bird she had carved when she was 12. She drove north. She bypassed the interstates, sticking to the 2-lane highways that snaked through the high desert of Nevada, the mountains of Idaho, and finally, the lush, green valleys of Washington state. She drove for 3 days, the rhythm of the road a soothing, rhythmic hum that allowed her mind to settle. She watched the world change from the bruised orange of the desert to the deep, emerald green of the Pacific Northwest. She arrived in Amak on a Tuesday evening, the sun setting behind the Cascades, casting long, dramatic shadows across the valley. The air smelled of rain and cedar, a scent that felt like a homecoming. She drove through the small town, past the diner where she'd had her first cup of coffee, past the high school where she'd dreamed of being a pilot. It felt like a lifetime ago. She pulled up to the small house on the edge of the woods, the one with the workshop in the back. It looked smaller than she remembered, the white paint peeling around the window frames, the garden overgrown with weeds. She sat in the Jeep for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled, the silence of the woods pressing in on her. She felt the cost then, a wave of grief that hit her with the force of a physical blow. She thought about the 5-second delay. She thought about the man she had killed, her uncle, a man who had shared her blood and her clarity. She thought about the people in the valley who would never know her name, and the institution that would never forgive her. She thought about the wings she had lost and the woman she had become. She got out of the Jeep and walked toward the workshop. The door was unlocked, the hinges groaning as she pushed it open. The interior was thick with dust, the light filtering through the high windows in long, golden shafts. The smell of cedar was still there, faint but unmistakable, a ghost of her father's presence. She walked over to the workbench, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn wood. She saw his tools, the planes and chisels she had learned to use before she could drive. She saw a half-finished chair in the corner, the wood raw and waiting. She sat down on the stool, her back straight, her hands resting on the workbench. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind in the trees, the sound of the world outside the machine. She wasn't Captain Vance anymore. She wasn't a pilot. She wasn't a system error. She was just Elena. She felt the weight of the last few days begin to lift, not all at once, but slowly, like the tide receding. She had found the knot. She had cut it out. And while the house was broken, the foundation was still there. She reached out and picked up a piece of cedar, a small, rough block that had been left on the bench. She felt the texture of it, the way the grain ran straight and true. She picked up a small hand plane, the metal cool and familiar in her palm. She began to work. The first curl of wood came away with a soft, shushing sound, a ribbon of pale cedar that smelled of the earth. She watched it fall to the floor, a tiny, perfect thing. She took another pass, and then another, her movements rhythmic and precise. She wasn't thinking about the 1 5-second gap. She wasn't thinking about the dark competence. She was just watching the wood. She worked until the sun went down and the workshop was filled with shadows. She worked until her arms ached and her mind was quiet. She worked until the block of wood was smooth and the grain was clear. In the silence of the Amak evening, with the smell of the forest all around her, Elena Vance finally understood the truth of the architect's legacy. It wasn't about the technology. It wasn't about the targets. It was about the clarity. It was about the ability to see the world for what it was and the courage to act when the world was wrong. She had paid the cost. She had lost her career, her identity, and her sense of belonging. But she had found something deeper. She had found the straight grain of her own soul. She stood up and walked to the door of the workshop, the small piece of cedar in her hand. She looked out at the mountains, the peaks silhouetted against the starlit sky. She felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile thing that was beginning to take root in the wreckage of her life. It wasn't a grand hope. It wasn't a promise of a new career or a public vindication. It was just the hope of a quiet life, a life built on the truth. The institution would continue to grind. The machines would continue to fly. But in this small corner of the world, the grain was finally straight. Elena Vance turned off the light in the workshop and walked toward the house, the sound of her boots on the gravel the only noise in the quiet night. She didn't look back, she didn't have to. She knew exactly where she was and she knew exactly who she was. The 1 5-second delay was gone. The gap was closed. The story of the pilot who saw too much would become a legend in some circles, a cautionary tale in others, and a classified report in the vaults of the Pentagon. But for Elena, it was just the moment she had decided to become a human being again. She opened the front door of the house, the smell of home wrapping around her like a blanket. She stepped inside and closed the door, the click of the latch final and certain. In the window of the workshop, the moon reflected off the surface of the freshly planed cedar, a single, brilliant line of light in the darkness. The wood was strong. The knot was gone. She reached up to her collar, where her silver oak leaves used to be, and felt only the rough, honest texture of her father's old flannel shirt.